I am Ruben, 68 years old, and somehow still navigating the wreckage of a family betrayal I never saw coming. During a routine business trip to Chicago, I stopped at a grocery store and saw a homeless woman holding a baby, desperately trying to pay for a can of formula. I froze. It was my daughter, but she was supposed to be in a luxury penthouse in New York. When she saw me, she burst into tears and said her husband had dumped her there. My blood boiled. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. The driving rain of a Chicago Tuesday hammered against the windshield of my rental car as I arrived. I had flown in from Atlanta to finalize a warehouse acquisition for my logistics company, maintaining my usual working-class disguise. I wore a faded canvas jacket and scuffed work boots, shielding my true corporate identity from the world. I stepped into a rundown grocery store on the south side to grab a bottle of water before my return flight. The fluorescent lights inside flickered constantly, casting a sickly yellow hue over the cracked linoleum floor. I walked toward the checkout lane and stopped dead in my tracks. A young woman stood at the register shivering violently in a damp, oversized coat. She held a crying infant tightly against her chest with one arm, while frantically digging through a plastic bag with her free hand. The teenage cashier tapped his fingers on the counter with a deep, impatient scowl. The store manager, a burly man with a flushed face and an aggressive posture, stepped forward immediately. He snatched the small can of baby formula directly off the scanner. He pointed a thick finger at the shivering woman. He told her that if her debit card declined a third time, she needed to leave the premises immediately. He announced loudly to the entire line of waiting customers that his grocery store was not a free charity for careless people. The woman looked up, her face pale and utterly exhausted, completely devoid of hope. I dropped my bottle of water on the floor. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stepped forward, reaching into my pocket. I pulled a crisp $100 bill from my money clip and slammed it onto the counter with absolute authority. I ordered the cashier to keep the change and process the transaction without any further delay. I grabbed the baby formula and turned my full attention to the store manager. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a lethal clarity that demanded immediate obedience. I informed him that if he ever spoke to another human being with such profound disrespect again, I would purchase his miserable store for the sole purpose of firing him publicly. The manager backed away instantly, completely intimidated by my unyielding tone. He stammered a broken apology and retreated toward his back office without uttering another word. I turned my attention back to the terrified young mother standing before me. The other customers in the aisle remained perfectly silent, watching the entire exchange with wide eyes. I picked up the plastic shopping bags she had dropped on the floor and handed them back to her. I placed my hand gently on the woman's trembling shoulder to offer comfort. She flinched sharply, turning around with wild, frightened eyes. The rigid posture of survival shattered completely when she finally recognized my face. It was Alicia. She was my daughter. My brilliant, beautiful Alicia possessed a master's degree from Columbia University and carried herself with undeniable grace. She was supposed to be living safely in a sprawling New York penthouse with her wealthy white husband, Blake Whitcomb. Blake was the primary heir to a massive commercial real estate empire, projecting an image of absolute financial security. Seeing her standing in a freezing Chicago grocery store in torn clothes defied all logic. I did not scream or demand immediate answers in the middle of a crowded public space. I wrapped my heavy canvas coat around her shaking shoulders, shielding my newborn grandson from the cold draft of the automatic doors. I guided them quickly through the driving rain and secured them inside my heated rental vehicle. Once we were safely inside, I locked the doors and turned the heat up to maximum. I asked her why she was buying formula with a declined debit card when her wealthy in-laws claimed she was attending an exclusive wellness retreat in Switzerland. They had explicitly told me she simply needed quiet space after the difficult birth of her second child. Alicia clutched the newborn baby tightly to her chest and wept with a profound desperation that tore my soul apart. She looked at me with a broken expression and confessed the brutal truth. She explained that the entire wellness retreat story was a meticulously fabricated lie designed to keep me away from her. She had not spoken to a single doctor or boarded any flight to Europe. Alicia revealed that Blake stole her 2-year-old son and entirely froze her personal bank accounts. He falsely claimed she suffered a severe postpartum psychotic break to legally justify his actions. He paid a corrupt private psychiatrist to sign an emergency medical evaluation without ever actually examining her in person. They kept her older son captive inside their heavily guarded estate. Then, Blake's private security team forced her onto an unmarked jet, flew her directly to Chicago, and abandoned her at a cheap motel with only the newborn. They threatened that if she tried to return to New York or contact me for help, they would use the fabricated medical records to permanently strip her parental rights. My blood turned to ice. I grew up in an era where respect was earned through brutal sweat and survival on the loading docks. I worked double shifts for decades to ensure Alicia never had to face the indignity of poverty. When she married Blake, I maintained my distance and allowed his arrogant family to believe I was nothing more than a retired blue-collar worker who scraped by on a small pension. I kept my multi-billion-dollar logistics wealth entirely invisible. I asked Alicia why Blake would resort to stealing from her when his family supposedly possessed hundreds of millions. She wiped her tear-stained face and revealed that the Whitcomb portfolio was highly over-leveraged and essentially bankrupt. He orchestrated the fake mental breakdown to gain emergency legal conservatorship over her massive hidden trust fund. Her desperate explanation was cut short abruptly. Her damaged cell phone vibrated violently in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out and stared at the bright screen in pure terror. The caller identification displayed Blake's name. The true nightmare had just arrived at our doorstep. I took the vibrating phone from Alicia's trembling hand and pressed the accept button. I held the device to my ear, but did not utter a single syllable. I simply breathed, establishing the exact silence that had built my entire empire. Blake's arrogant voice immediately filled the tight space of the vehicle, dripping with the unearned confidence of generational wealth. He did not ask if she was safe. He did not ask about the newborn child she was carrying. He launched directly into a calculated, condescending threat. He demanded that Alicia immediately sign the digital transfer forms for her remaining corporate shares. He informed her that if she refused, or if she attempted to contact her pathetic working-class father for legal assistance, she would permanently lose all custody rights to Leo. He boasted about the airtight validity of the psychiatric evaluation he had purchased. He claimed no family court judge would ever side with an unstable, homeless woman over the prestigious Whitcomb name. He gave her exactly 24 hours to comply before he initiated the final legal severance. He laughed a hollow, mocking laugh, assuring her that she had absolutely no leverage left. He instructed her to find a public library, print the documents, and fax them to his legal team by dawn. I absorbed every sharp, poisonous word without reacting. I memorized the cadence of his entitlement. I did not scream, and I did not issue empty warnings. A man who plans to dismantle a kingdom does not announce his arrival to the false king. I ended the call with a deliberate press of my thumb. I did not give Blake the satisfaction of a response, leaving his hollow threats hanging in the digital void. I placed the phone in my pocket and shifted the car into drive. We navigated through the relentless Chicago rain until we reached the private underground entrance of the Drake Hotel. I bypassed the standard lobby and used my corporate credentials to secure the top-floor penthouse suite. I paid in cash, ensuring no immediate digital footprint could track our location. Once the heavy oak doors of the suite locked behind us, the immediate physical danger evaporated. The room was warm, silent, and impenetrable. Alicia collapsed onto the velvet sofa, entirely exhausted. I ordered room service and watched my brilliant daughter prepare a bottle of formula for my newborn grandson. The sight of her bruised dignity ignited a cold, calculated fire within my chest. I had spent 4 decades sacrificing my own comfort, working in freezing warehouses and driving rigs across state lines specifically to build an invisible fortress of wealth for her. I had endured the condescension of men like Blake Whitcomb because I knew my silence was my greatest weapon. They looked at my scuffed boots and faded canvas jackets and saw a powerless man. They mistook my humility for weakness. As Alicia fed the baby, her tears finally slowing, I made a silent vow. I would not merely rescue my daughter. I would systematically dismantle the Whitcomb family's entire legacy. I would tear down their aristocratic facade brick by brick and leave them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I stepped onto the private balcony, letting the freezing wind hit my face while I opened my heavily encrypted laptop. I navigated past the primary security firewalls of my logistics network and initiated a secure video call to my chief corporate attorney. Harvey answered on the very first ring. Harvey was a ruthless, brilliant legal mind who had orchestrated every major hostile takeover for my company over the past 20 years. He understood the absolute severity of a midnight call. I bypassed all standard greetings and pleasantries. I gave him a direct, unequivocal command. I ordered a complete, unsparing forensic audit of Whitcomb Real Estate Holdings. I instructed Harvey to tear through their corporate veils, their subsidiary shell companies, and their offshore routing numbers. I needed a flawless map of their debt structure, their upcoming loan covenants, and their exact liquidity ratios. Most importantly, I demanded the exact GPS location of the capital Blake had just forcefully extracted from Alicia's personal accounts. Harvey did not ask irrelevant questions about my sudden interest in my son-in-law's portfolio. He recognized the lethal, measured tone in my voice. He simply nodded his eyes, reflecting the blue light of his multiple monitors. He promised to have the entire financial autopsy delivered to my encrypted inbox before sunrise. They believed they were playing a game of family court manipulation. They had no idea they had just invited a corporate predator into their financial bloodstream. I instructed Harvey to awaken our entire accounting division if necessary, authorizing unlimited overtime pay. The financial destruction of Blake Whitcomb was now the absolute top priority of my entire corporate empire. Exactly 2 hours later, the encrypted communication line chimed. Harvey appeared on the screen, his expression grim but victorious. He immediately shared his screen, revealing a tangled web of red ledger entries and defaulted loan warnings. He had discovered a catastrophic anomaly buried deep within the Whitcomb banking records. The family was entirely bankrupt. Their pristine aristocratic image was nothing more than a hollow shell hiding massive toxic debt. They were severely over-leveraged on a dozen failing commercial properties across the East Coast. Harvey explained that Blake had recently committed to a massive acquisition known as the Hudson Tower Project, an acquisition he absolutely could not afford. Facing total financial ruin and the imminent foreclosure of his generational estate, Blake panicked. Harvey revealed the exact nature of the medical fraud. Blake had not forged those psychiatric documents merely to gain custody of his son. The custody battle was a smokescreen. He used the fraudulent medical conservatorship to bypass the strict banking protocols of Alicia's private wealth. By declaring her mentally incapacitated, Blake legally bypassed the dual signature requirement. He stole exactly $50 million from Alicia's hidden trust fund. He wired the stolen capital directly into a commercial escrow account to secure the Hudson Tower development and save his family from immediate bankruptcy. He assumed the trust was a standard unprotected inheritance. He thought he had successfully stolen my daughter's future to salvage his own. He believed he had outsmarted a naive young woman and her helpless blue-collar father. He failed to comprehend that I had built that trust with an ironclad architecture designed to execute anyone who attempted to breach it without authorization. The stolen $50 million was not their salvation. It was the exact instrument of their impending corporate execution. I stared at the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop, thoroughly analyzing the complex web of financial data Harvey had just delivered to my secure inbox. The red ledger entries painted a pathetic picture of Blake Whitcomb and his supposedly untouchable aristocratic lineage. I had spent the last 3 decades anticipating a predator exactly like him. When Alicia was a teenager, I realized my immense logistics wealth could easily attract ruthless men who viewed her as a convenient stepping stone for their own selfish corporate ambitions. I established her primary trust fund under heavily guarded layers of legal armor, designing it as an absolute fortress to protect her future. I intentionally structured the document to perfectly resemble a standard generous family inheritance. I knew that arrogant men rarely bother to read the intricate fine print when they believe they hold absolute leverage over a situation. Blake looked at me and saw a simple blue-collar father-in-law. He looked at Alicia and saw a vulnerable wife he could easily discard. He saw a completely defenseless target to save his crumbling real estate empire. I was so utterly blinded by his unearned entitlement that he completely bypassed the core structural covenants embedded deep within the final pages of the trust agreement. He forged those psychiatric documents and authorized the massive wire transfer with the reckless, unchecked confidence of a man who has never faced a genuine consequence in his entire life. He never expected a retired truck driver to lay a highly sophisticated financial minefield. He eagerly took the bait, stealing $50 million and effectively sealing his own inescapable corporate destruction. Harvey cleared his throat over the secure video connection, his face illuminated by the stark white light of his multiple office monitors. He explained the catastrophic legal reality Blake had just triggered, by moving that specific amount of capital without proper authorization. I had insisted on embedding a highly aggressive defensive mechanism called the conversion clause into the very foundation of Alicia's financial portfolio. Harvey detailed exactly how the mechanism functioned, with ruthless mathematical precision. Any unauthorized extraction of capital exceeding $10 million automatically converted the stolen funds into senior secured equity within the receiving corporate entity. Blake did not simply steal $50 million in untraceable cash to secretly fund the massive Hudson Tower development project. By illegally wiring that money directly into the primary operating accounts of Whitcomb Real Estate Holdings, he unknowingly activated the defensive covenant. Harvey confirmed that the immediate transfer legally constituted a massive hostile equity purchase on my behalf. Blake had effectively surrendered the controlling majority stake of his entire generational family company directly to my corporate umbrella. I tried to steal my daughter's hard-earned wealth to save his sinking commercial project, and in doing so, he handed me the absolute ownership of his entire empire. Harvey smiled a rare predatory smile as he finalized the complex legal documentation on his end of the screen. He assured me the transaction was entirely legally binding, utterly irreversible, and already formally filed with the appropriate federal financial oversight agencies. The Whitcomb family no longer owned the lavish properties they constantly flaunted to high society. They were now merely unauthorized, penniless tenants occupying buildings that belonged entirely to the man they had mocked and dismissed for years. I absorbed the heavy information with a cold, steady satisfaction. The financial trap had snapped shut, completely, utterly breaking the back of their arrogant dynasty. I immediately formulated my ruthless counterattack, refusing to waste a single second of this newly acquired legal leverage. Harvey informed me that the Whitcomb family was hosting a massive high society gala in New York tonight. They were throwing a lavish, highly publicized celebration at their sprawling Long Island estate to formally announce their fraudulent real estate acquisition and secure secondary investors for the Hudson Tower project. They planned to drink expensive champagne and accept the loud applause of their wealthy peers while my daughter sat traumatized and shivering in a foreign city. I instructed Harvey to mobilize our entire corporate legal division and prepare for a highly coordinated tactical strike. I ordered him to contact his tight connections within the federal authorities and secure immediate, undeniable arrest warrants for severe medical fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Blake had crossed a highly dangerous federal line the moment he paid a corrupt doctor to falsify psychiatric documents and forcibly transported Alicia across state borders against her will. I demanded that the armed federal marshals be fully briefed and completely ready to breach the iron gates of the Whitcomb estate before the night ended. Harvey agreed without any hesitation, recognizing that this was no longer just a corporate takeover, but a targeted annihilation of a criminal enterprise. I told him to gather the physical corporate ownership deeds and meet me directly in New York at the designated time. I wanted the absolute element of total surprise. I wanted Blake to look directly into the eyes of the man he underestimated right as his entire world collapsed into absolute dust. I closed the laptop abruptly, severing the secure connection with Harvey. The quiet hum of the Chicago hotel room provided a stark contrast to the massive storm I was about to unleash upon the East Coast. I walked back into the main living area of the luxurious penthouse suite to check on my family. Alicia had finally fallen asleep on the velvet sofa, her arms wrapped fiercely and protectively around her newborn son. I contacted my elite private security firm and dispatched a full team of highly trained armed guards to stand directly outside her hotel door. I ensured she would be completely protected from any further Whitcomb interference, while I personally handled the architects of her suffering. I left a brief, reassuring handwritten note on the glass coffee table, promising her that the terrifying nightmare would be entirely over by morning. I gathered my few belongings and headed straight to Midway Airport, where my private Gulfstream jet was already fueled and waiting on the dark tarmac. During the smooth flight to New York, I deliberately ignored the private closet containing my expensive tailored Italian business suits. I chose to maintain my carefully crafted disguise, projecting the exact working-class image the Whitcomb family expected of me. I pulled on my heavy oil-stained canvas work jacket and laced up my heavily scuffed leather work boots. I wore the faded, rough clothing of a man who spent his life loading heavy freight trucks, refusing to conform to their shallow, aristocratic standards. If Blake and his wealthy parents wanted to treat me like a poor, insignificant peasant, I would give them exactly the aesthetic they expected right before I destroyed their lives. The flight was short, giving me ample time to mentally finalize every single step of my impending confrontation. The jet wheels touched down heavily on the New York runway just as the sun began to set. I stepped out of the aircraft and into a waiting black SUV. The stage was perfectly set for a brutal physical confrontation, and I was fully prepared to watch their arrogant dynasty burn to the ground. The black SUV rolled to a smooth stop at the bottom of the sweeping circular driveway of the Whitcomb estate on Long Island. I stepped out into the crisp, biting night air and immediately felt the immense scale of the financial illusion Blake and his family had constructed over the decades. The sprawling three-story stone mansion was illuminated by massive exterior floodlights, projecting a towering image of untouchable aristocratic wealth. The primary driveway was heavily congested with an endless parade of imported luxury sports cars, stretch limousines, and sleek black sedans. Uniformed valets rushed frantically through the rain-slicked courtyard, opening passenger doors for men clad in perfectly tailored tuxedos and women draped in heavy diamond necklaces. These were the elite commercial investors and high society socialites the Whitcomb family was currently attempting to defraud. I did not wait for an arrogant valet to approach my vehicle. I buttoned my faded oil-stained canvas work jacket and bypassed the designated guest reception line entirely. I walked with heavy, deliberate strides directly toward the towering, intricately carved oak doors of the main entrance. The abrasive sound of my heavily scuffed leather work boots, striking the wet cobblestone, echoed loudly against the low hum of classical string music drifting from the open terrace windows. The wealthy attendees standing near the entrance portico stared at my rough appearance in sheer bewilderment, instinctively pulling their expensive silk coats tighter around their shoulders as I marched past them without breaking my relentless, unyielding stride toward the front doors. Before my hands could grasp the heavy brass handles of the mansion, 2 private security guards stepped squarely into my path. They were large, broad-shouldered men, wearing expensive dark suits, their ears equipped with coiled communication earpieces. The lead guard crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes scanning my frayed canvas jacket and muddy boots with poorly concealed amusement. He smirked, assuming I was a lost, confused laborer who had wandered onto the wrong property. He informed me in a dripping, condescending tone that the service entrance for the catering staff was located around the back of the estate near the garbage receptacles. He ordered me to turn around immediately before he was forced to physically escort me off the private grounds. I did not raise my voice, and I did not flinch at his aggressive posture. I stepped directly into his personal space, closing the physical distance until my face was merely inches from his jaw. I looked deep into his eyes and dismantled his false authority with absolute icy precision. I informed him that I was the father of the bride, and that he was currently standing between a deeply enraged man and the people who had just stolen his infant grandson. I calmly told him that if he did not step aside in exactly 3 seconds, I would personally ensure his security firm lost every commercial contract on the East Coast by morning. The sheer gravity of my unblinking stare shattered his arrogant smirk completely. He recognized the lethal, uncompromising certainty of a man who possessed the actual power to destroy him. The lead guard swallowed hard, visibly trembling, and silently stepped backward. He lowered his arms and cleared a direct path for me, pulling the heavy oak doors open himself without uttering a single meaningless word of protest. I stepped across the threshold and breached the grand foyer of the Whitcomb estate, instantly immersing myself in the blinding epicenter of their fraudulent high society celebration. The massive ballroom glittered under the brilliant light of 3 immense crystal chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling. Hundreds of elite investors, corporate bankers, and wealthy socialites mingled in small, tight circles, sipping rare vintage champagne from delicate glass flutes. The room smelled of expensive imported perfumes and the rich aroma of catered caviar. The sheer extravagance of the display disgusted me, knowing it was entirely funded by the capital they had desperately stolen from my daughter's hidden trust. As I walked forward, the live string quartet playing on a raised wooden platform abruptly faltered, the musicians losing their rhythm at the shocking sight of my intrusion. A heavy, palpable silence spread rapidly across the ballroom, rippling outward from the entrance like a shockwave. Conversation ceased instantly. The glittering guests turned their heads to stare at me, their faces contorting in sheer, unadulterated revulsion. They looked at my weather-beaten cap, my grease-stained jacket, and my muddy, scuffed work boots with absolute aristocratic horror. With every heavy step I took, my wet boots left stark, dark, muddy marks against the pristine white marble floor. I was a walking, physical manifestation of the gritty reality they spent their entire lives attempting to ignore. The wealthy attendees instinctively parted before me, creating a wide, empty path through the center of the crowded room, terrified that my working-class grime might somehow transfer onto their custom designer gowns. I did not break my steady, predatory pace. I surveyed the sprawling room with the calculating eyes of a man preparing to execute a complete corporate slaughter, searching the sea of stunned faces for the architect of my Alicia's suffering. I finally spotted Blake standing at the base of the sweeping grand staircase on the far side of the ballroom. He was holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, laughing arrogantly with a tight group of commercial real estate developers. Flanking him were his aristocratic parents, Charles and Victoria Whitcomb, both projecting an aura of untouchable generational superiority. Charles wore a flawless custom tuxedo, while Victoria was draped in a dark sapphire gown, a massive diamond necklace resting heavily against her collarbone. Blake turned his head and caught sight of me, advancing down the center of the marble floor. The arrogant, triumphant smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a flash of genuine wide-eyed panic. He quickly set his drink on a passing waiter's tray and leaned in to whisper furiously to his parents. Charles and Victoria snapped their heads in my direction, their polished expressions twisting into identical masks of furious high society outrage, desperate to prevent me from causing a catastrophic public scene in front of their primary financial suckers. The entire Whitcomb family abandoned their guests and marched directly toward me. They moved as a unified front, intercepting me near the towering ice sculpture in the very middle of the room. Blake hissed through his teeth, demanding to know how I had bypassed their security detail. Hein threatened to have me arrested for criminal trespassing if I did not turn around immediately. Charles Whitcomb stepped in front of his son, raising his hand to silence him, projecting the supreme arrogance of a man who believed every human being had a clear purchase price. Charles reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a leather-bound checkbook and clicked a solid gold pen. He coldly offered to buy my total silence to protect their fragile, crumbling public image. Charles Whitcomb stepped into my personal space, his face flushed with the indignant fury of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. He ripped the $10,000 check from his leather booklet and shoved it forcefully against the damp canvas of my work jacket. He ordered me to take the money, turn around, and walk off his property before his private security team dragged me out by my collar. He spoke to me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered onto his manicured lawn. I did not raise my hands to accept his bribe. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I simply allowed the crisp piece of paper to flutter down to the pristine marble floor, landing silently near the tip of my scuffed work boot. The surrounding guests gasped quietly at the blatant rejection of such a sum. I ignored their whispers and focused entirely on the arrogant patriarch standing before me. I demanded the immediate location of my stolen grandson. I projected my voice clearly across the cavernous ballroom, ensuring every wealthy investor and corporate banker present heard the accusation. I stated that my grandson had been forcibly taken from his mother by armed guards under a fraudulent psychiatric hold, and I was not leaving the premises without him. Charles sneered, attempting to maintain his facade of aristocratic control, while his eyes darted nervously toward his high-profile guests. He thought his wealth made him legally untouchable. Hun had no idea the ground he stood on was already gone. Victoria Whitcomb moved forward, her heavy diamond necklace catching the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers above. She placed a restraining hand on her husband's arm, stepping seamlessly into the role of the offended matriarch. She raised her chin, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She addressed the silent crowd of elite socialites, projecting her voice to ensure her narrative dominated the room. She publicly declared that my daughter was a deeply disturbed, deranged woman who could not escape the inherent instability of her lower-class upbringing. She claimed Alicia had suffered a violent psychotic break and willingly abandoned her newborn child in a freezing city because she lacked the maternal instinct required to survive in high society. Victoria utilized every weapon of elite etiquette to systematically dismantle my family's dignity. She spoke of our supposed poverty with profound pity, framing the Whitcomb family as the generous saviors who were simply protecting an innocent child from a reckless, unhinged mother. She accused me of showing up uninvited to extort money from them during a private celebration, twisting my demand for my grandson into a pathetic plea for a financial handout. She expected me to scream, to lash out violently, to fulfill the exact stereotype she was currently painting for her wealthy audience. I absorbed every single venomous insult with absolute impenetrable silence. I did not defend Alicia's brilliant academic record or her flawless character. I did not boast about my own invisible wealth. I let Victoria dig her grave deeper with every arrogant syllable she uttered. I simply stood my ground, my hands resting loosely at my sides, watching her perform her aristocratic charade. My silence unnerved her, causing her polished smile to falter as she realized she was striking a solid wall of granite. Blake stepped out from behind his parents, his face pale and slick with a sudden terrified sweat. He lacked the seasoned composure of his father, his panic visibly fracturing the confident image he desperately tried to project to his commercial backers. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his tailored tuxedo pocket and aimed it at me like a weapon. He shouted that my silent intimidation tactics would not work against his family. Hein threatened to call the local police immediately to have me arrested for criminal trespassing and severe harassment. He loudly promised to ensure the arresting officers locked me away long enough for his legal team to secure permanent uncontested custody of both children. He arrogantly believed the local authorities served as a private security force for the local billionaires. He demanded that I surrender quietly or face the complete destruction of my remaining years in a concrete cell. I watched his hand tremble as he dialed the first digit. I did not stop him. I reached deliberately inside the deep breast pocket of my faded canvas jacket. Several wealthy guests gasped, taking frightened steps backward, assuming a man of my rugged appearance might be reaching for a dangerous weapon. Instead, I pulled out a thick, heavily bound legal dossier stamped with stark federal notary seals. A waiter paralyzed by the tension stood frozen beside me, holding a polished silver serving tray loaded with untouched champagne flutes. I raised my hand and dropped the massive stack of certified documents directly onto the silver tray. The heavy thud of the thick paper hitting the polished metal echoed sharply across the entirely silent ballroom, shattering the last remaining illusion of their control. The documents carried the full, undeniable weight of total corporate annihilation. I turned my attention away from the trembling son and focused directly on the arrogant father. I announced to the entire ballroom that I was officially executing an immediate commercial lien against Whitcomb Real Estate Holdings. I projected my voice so the surrounding investors could hear every devastating detail. I informed Charles that the $50 million Blake had stolen from my daughter's trust fund had triggered an aggressive corporate conversion clause. I explained that the illegal wire transfer had legally and irreversibly surrendered 80% of their entire family portfolio directly to my logistics corporation. Charles stared at the silver tray, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. I clearly stated that the Whitcomb family no longer owned the sprawling Long Island estate where we currently stood. I informed the gasping crowd of commercial backers that the highly publicized Hudson Tower project now belonged exclusively to my corporate umbrella. The wealthy guests began whispering frantically, stepping away from the Whitcomb family, as if their sudden bankruptcy were a highly contagious disease. Charles looked at his son with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror, realizing that Blake's desperate theft had just annihilated their entire generational legacy in a matter of seconds. Victoria clutched her diamond necklace, her face draining of all color, as the brutal reality of their sudden poverty set in. Before Blake could utter a single word of panicked denial, the heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung open with a thunderous crash. Harvey strode into the glittering room, his posture radiating absolute legal authority. He was flanked by a team of heavily armed federal marshals wearing tactical vests. The elite celebration was officially over, replaced by the crushing weight of federal justice. The heavy oak doors slammed against the walls, echoing like a thunderclap across the marble floor. 4 armed federal marshals moved into the glittering ballroom with absolute military precision. They spread out instantly, securing the perimeter and blocking all primary exits. The sheer terror in the room was palpable. Wealthy real estate investors and elite socialites, accustomed to untouchable privilege, backed away in a synchronized wave of panic. Crystal champagne flutes shattered against the floor as attendees desperately distanced themselves from the Whitcomb family. The illusion of their aristocratic safety vanished the moment tactical vests and federal badges breached their private sanctuary. Harvey strode deliberately through the parted crowd, his bespoke suit a sharp contrast to his lethal corporate intent. He stopped directly in front of the trembling groom. He did not offer a polite greeting. He raised a thick stack of certified legal documents and pressed them firmly against Blake Whitcomb's chest. Harvey projected his voice with flawless courtroom authority, ensuring the silent, terrified audience heard every single syllable. He formally served Blake with federal warrants for grand larceny, interstate wire fraud, and severe medical fraud. The words hung in the suffocating air, severing Blake from his high society pedestal. The golden boy of New York real estate stood completely frozen, his tailored tuxedo offering zero protection against the crushing weight of the United States justice system. He looked down at the federal seals on the documents, his breath hitching as the reality of his impending destruction finally registered. Blake frantically dropped his crystal tumbler, splashing expensive scotch across his polished leather shoes. He grabbed the documents and began stammering a desperate, chaotic defense. He pointed a shaking finger at Harvey, loudly proclaiming that the federal charges were entirely baseless. He shouted that he possessed an ironclad, court-approved medical conservatorship over my daughter. He attempted to rally the surrounding investors, insisting he was merely a concerned husband, protecting his family assets from an unstable, mentally incapacitated wife. He claimed the $50 million transfer was a perfectly legal maneuver, authorized under his emergency fiduciary rights. I stepped forward, cutting off his pathetic, unhinged rant with a voice forged in decades of corporate warfare. I dismantled his entire narrative with absolute surgical precision. I informed him and the listening crowd that his purchased psychiatric evaluation was utterly worthless. I revealed that a state-appointed judge in Chicago, flanked by my own elite team of independent medical professionals, had conducted a comprehensive evaluation of Alicia merely 3 hours ago. The presiding judge had officially cleared my daughter of all psychiatric holds and completely nullified the emergency order. I stated clearly that the conservatorship he relied upon was now officially classified as a fraudulent, weaponized instrument of financial abuse. I watched the remaining blood drain entirely from Blake's face. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The legal shield he built using a corrupt doctor had been obliterated before he even knew he was under attack. He had assumed his wealth insulated him from scrutiny. Hum never fathomed that I possessed the logistical power to mobilize a federal judge and a top-tier medical board on a Sunday evening. His fabricated narrative of the deranged wife crumbled into dust, exposing him as a desperate, reckless thief, standing naked before the very peers he sought to impress. Harvey stepped into the silence, taking command of the room to deliver the final financial death blow. He addressed the terrified syndicate of investors who had gathered to fund the Hudson Tower project. He explained the brutal mechanics of the conversion clause embedded within Alicia's trust fund. Harvey detailed how the unauthorized extraction of $50 million did not simply empty a bank account. It triggered an automatic, irreversible hostile equity purchase. By wiring those stolen funds directly into the primary operating accounts of Whitcomb Real Estate Holdings, Blake unknowingly initiated a catastrophic legal cascade. Harvey announced with cold, undeniable authority that my logistics corporation now officially owned exactly 80% of the entire Whitcomb generational portfolio. The remaining investors gasped collectively, realizing the lucrative commercial contracts they were about to sign were entirely worthless. Charles Whitcomb turned slowly toward his son, his aristocratic composure shattering into raw, unadulterated fury. The patriarch realized Blake's staggering arrogance had just bankrupted their entire lineage. Charles grabbed Blake by the collar of his expensive tuxedo, shaking him violently in front of the stunned elite crowd. He screamed at his son, demanding to know how he could be stupid enough to wire unauthorized trust funds directly into their primary corporate ledger without consulting their legal team. Charles realized they were no longer the kings of New York real estate. They were destitute, humiliated tenants, occupying a mansion owned entirely by a man wearing a faded canvas jacket and muddy work boots. Charles realized his entire legacy had been wiped out because his son underestimated the wrong family. The patriarch spat curses at his heir, recognizing that the $50 million was never their salvation. It was a sophisticated financial guillotine, and Blake had eagerly placed their entire empire directly under the blade. I watched the Whitcomb family devour themselves from the inside out, feeling absolutely no trace of pity. I turned my attention to the lead federal marshal standing at attention beside me. I gave a single sharp nod and ordered him to execute the warrants immediately. 2 heavily armed marshals stepped forward and grabbed Blake by his arms. They forced him to turn around and slammed him roughly against the towering ice sculpture in the center of the ballroom. The jarring click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed sharply across the silent room. Blake did not fight back. He slumped in their unyielding grip, sobbing openly as the marshals read him his Miranda rights in a loud, booming voice. He was humiliated, stripped of his unearned power, and reduced to a broken criminal, crying in front of his wealthy peers. Victoria Whitcomb wailed in despair, reaching out for her son, as the officers forcefully escorted him through the parted crowd and out toward the flashing lights of the waiting federal transport vehicles. I ignored her dramatic display of aristocratic grief. I focused entirely on Charles, who stood paralyzed amidst the wreckage of his shattered empire. I stepped within an inch of his face, projecting a lethal, uncompromising authority that demanded total submission. I informed him that his company was gone, his son was facing decades in a federal penitentiary, and his social standing was permanently annihilated. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and issued my final non-negotiable command. I demanded he hand over my stolen grandson immediately, or I would instruct Harvey to initiate severe criminal charges against him and his wife as active accomplices to a federal kidnapping. Charles Whitcomb watched his son being dragged out of the grand ballroom in federal handcuffs, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the marble floors. The total annihilation of his generational wealth finally shattered his aristocratic composure. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward me, desperately attempting to salvage whatever remained of his ruined empire. He forced a strained, pathetic smile, trying to project a camaraderie that had never existed. He's pleaded with me to reconsider the complete liquidation of his family portfolio. He offered to co-manage the commercial properties under my logistics umbrella, promising to use his high society connections to smooth over the transition. He swore he would personally force Blake to sign the divorce papers and surrender all custody rights without a legal fight. Persisted I agreed to drop the federal charges and return the Long Island estate. I looked at the broken patriarch with absolute, unyielding indifference. I did not entertain his desperate bargaining or acknowledge his sudden willingness to cooperate. I informed him that negotiations are reserved for honorable businessmen who operate with integrity and respect. I stated clearly that predators who steal children and discard vulnerable women do not receive compromises. I told him he had sat at a lavish dining table and actively planned to permanently separate a mother from her newborn infant just to secure a real estate deal. I rejected his offer, instantly cementing his absolute financial destruction. I turned my attention away from the trembling patriarch and focused entirely on retrieving the only piece of this estate that truly mattered. I demanded to know the exact location of my stolen grandson, projecting my voice so every remaining guest and federal marshal could hear my unyielding authority. Victoria Whitcomb pointed a shaking finger toward the upper level of the sprawling mansion, completely stripped of her previous aristocratic arrogance. A moment later, a terrified nanny hurried down the sweeping grand staircase, clutching 2-year-old Leo tightly against her chest. The young boy looked visibly confused and frightened by the heavy police presence and the chaotic atmosphere filling his usually quiet home. He clutched a small, faded stuffed bear, his wide eyes scanning the crowd of strangers and armed officers. The moment his gaze locked onto my face, the fear instantly vanished from his expression. His eyes lit up with profound, genuine recognition. He cried out for his grandfather, reaching his small, desperate arms toward me across the remaining distance of the marble foyer. I stepped forward and gently took my grandson from the trembling nanny, wrapping my arms around his small frame and pulling him securely against my chest. He buried his face in the rough canvas of my work jacket, finding immediate comfort in the familiar scent of the man who had loved him since birth. A profound, overwhelming surge of protective relief washed over my entire body. The primary mission of this hostile breach was officially accomplished. I had successfully infiltrated the enemy's stronghold, dismantled their fraudulent defenses, and reclaimed the innocent child they had ruthlessly weaponized. Holding Leo in my arms solidified the absolute necessity of the financial devastation I had just inflicted upon the Whitcomb family. I adjusted Leo securely in my arms and turned my back entirely on the shattered remains of the Whitcomb family. The federal marshals continued to secure the ballroom, interrogating the remaining guests, while the brutal reality of the corporate takeover settled heavily over the estate. Charles and Victoria stood paralyzed near the base of the grand staircase, looking around at the lavish crystal chandeliers and expensive art collections they no longer legally owned. I paused near the heavy oak doors, ensuring my voice carried the unmistakable weight of absolute ruthless finality. I issued my final non-negotiable command to the defeated patriarch standing in the ruins of his social empire. I gave Charles and Victoria exactly 48 hours to completely vacate the Long Island premises. I informed them that my elite corporate liquidators would arrive precisely at dawn on Wednesday to seize catalog and systematically liquidate every single asset inside the mansion to cover the extensive damages their son had inflicted upon my daughter. I explicitly warned them that if they attempted to remove any valuable artwork, diamond jewelry, or antique furniture during their mandated evacuation, Harvey would immediately press additional federal theft charges against them both. I told Charles he would leave the sprawling estate with absolutely nothing but the tailored clothes currently on his back, and the crushing knowledge that his own unearned arrogance had permanently destroyed his lineage. I did not wait for his pathetic response or his wife's dramatic tears. I stepped through the grand doorway and walked out into the crisp, freezing New York night, leaving the false kings to choke on the bitter ashes of their own absolute ruin. I carried my grandson down the sprawling driveway, ignoring the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles securing the perimeter. I climbed into the back of my waiting black SUV, shielding Leo from the chaotic aftermath of the high society raid. My private driver navigated swiftly away from the Long Island estate, heading directly toward the private airfield, where my jet was already fueled and waiting. The flight back to Chicago was quiet and entirely focused on the safety of the sleeping toddler resting against my chest. We landed at Midway Airport just before dawn, and a secure transport delivered us directly to the underground entrance of the Drake Hotel. I walked into the heavily guarded penthouse suite holding Leo in my arms. Alicia sprang up from the velvet sofa, her exhausted eyes widening in pure, overwhelming joy. She dropped to her knees on the thick carpet, pulling her older son into a desperate, fierce embrace, while tears streamed down her face. She buried her face in his neck, sobbing profound words of gratitude, as her fractured family was finally made whole again. The raw emotional reunion provided a fleeting moment of absolute peace, but the ruthless corporate war was far from over. My encrypted phone vibrated violently in my jacket pocket, shattering the quiet sanctuary of the hotel suite. It was Harvey calling on the secure emergency line. I stepped onto the balcony to answer, and his voice carried a sharp, urgent tension. He informed me that Charles Whitcomb had not accepted his defeat gracefully. In a desperate act of scorched earth retaliation, Charles had utilized his remaining corrupt political connections to hire a notorious corporate fixer. Harvey revealed that this fixer had just successfully initiated a massive illegal freeze on our primary East Coast freight routes, actively attempting to destroy my multi-billion-dollar logistics company from the inside out. Harvey spoke with a rapid mechanical intensity that immediately severed the brief sanctuary of the hotel room. He informed me that Charles Whitcomb had refused to accept the total liquidation of his generational empire quietly. In a desperate act of scorched earth retaliation, Charles had utilized his remaining corrupt political connections across the eastern seaboard. Harvey detailed how Charles had hired a highly specialized corporate fixer to weaponize state transportation regulations directly against my logistics company. Within the last 45 minutes, state troopers and commercial transport authorities had begun systematically impounding my freight trucks at major border checkpoints, spanning from New York to Pennsylvania. They were citing severely fabricated environmental safety violations and heavily forged weight distribution anomalies to legally justify the sudden massive blockades. Dozens of my primary delivery routes were completely frozen, severing the critical supply chains that funded my entire corporate operation. Harvey warned me that this aggressive synchronized legal assault was designed to drain my liquid capital and force me to the negotiation table. Charles intended to strangle my logistics empire until I agreed to return his Long Island estate and drop the federal charges against his son. I listened to the escalating crisis without allowing my heart rate to spike. I did not yell at Harvey or demand impossible miracles from my legal team. A man who controls billions in physical assets does not succumb to panic when a cornered rat bares its teeth. I recognized this tactic as the pathetic flailing of a defeated patriarch desperately attempting to project power he no longer possessed. I told Harvey to hold his position while I assessed the actual severity of the blockade. I instructed Harvey to send the live logistical tracking maps directly to my secure terminal and immediately ended the call. I opened my encrypted laptop and projected the digital routing interface onto the large television screen in the penthouse living room. Red warning icons flashed violently across the eastern seaboard, marking the exact geographic locations of my impounded freight vehicles. I analyzed the specific jurisdiction of every single fabricated regulatory violation with absolute, surgical precision. I cross-referenced the impound mandates with regional political districts and rapidly identified the central architect of the blockade. Every single forged mandate originated from the immediate jurisdiction of a highly corrupt regional transportation commissioner named Miller. I had dealt with men like Miller before, while building my company from a single rusted rig into a national powerhouse. They were opportunistic parasites who leased their political authority to desperate wealthy men like Charles Whitcomb in exchange for untraceable offshore capital. I knew instantly that Charles had paid Miller a massive bribe to orchestrate this sudden commercial strangulation. Harvey sent a follow-up message suggesting we file an emergency federal injunction to release the trucks through standard legal channels. I rejected his proposal entirely. Filing a formal lawsuit would take weeks of tedious courtroom litigation, costing my company millions in delayed delivery penalties. I refused to fight a corrupt politician within a legal system he already actively manipulated. I decided to sever the puppet strings directly at the source. I gathered my heavy canvas jacket and instructed my private security detail to maintain absolute lockdown protocols around Alicia and the children. I left the hotel and headed straight for the private airfield. I would not allow a local bureaucrat to disrupt the massive corporate infrastructure I had spent 35 years bleeding to build. My private jet touched down in New York, just as the morning commuter traffic began to clog the city highways. I bypassed my corporate headquarters entirely and instructed my driver to navigate toward the highly exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club. Harvey had tracked Commissioner Miller to this lavish, heavily guarded recreational fortress, where he spent his Tuesday mornings playing golf on the taxpayer dime. I stepped out of the black SUV wearing my heavily scuffed leather work boots and faded, oil-stained jacket. I ignored the pristine luxury vehicles lining the circular driveway and marched directly through the ornate glass doors of the primary clubhouse. The young, impeccably groomed receptionist at the front desk immediately attempted to intercept me, raising his voice to demand my membership credentials. I did not break my aggressive stride or acknowledge his pathetic attempt to block my path. I bypassed the polished mahogany reception desk, completely projecting a lethal, uncompromising authority that forced the club staff to physically step out of my way. I navigated the labyrinth of carpeted hallways using a digital blueprint Harvey had forwarded to my device. I breached the heavy wooden doors of the elite executive locker room. The scent of expensive cologne and rich cedar hung heavily in the humid air. I locked the primary entrance behind me, sliding the heavy brass deadbolt securely into place to prevent any security interference. I located Commissioner Miller standing near the back row of private lockers. He was a portly, arrogant man dressed in pristine golf attire, humming quietly to himself as he adjusted his expensive silk tie. He turned around to face me, his confident smile instantly vanishing as he registered my rough working-class appearance invading his private sanctuary. Miller puffed out his chest, attempting to project political intimidation as he demanded to know how I had bypassed the club security. I did not waste time exchanging empty threats or listening to his fabricated authority. I closed the distance between us in 3 rapid steps and slammed a thick manila folder violently against the steel door of his personal locker. I informed him that the folder contained a comprehensive, undeniable record of his massive underground gambling debts. I detailed exactly how much he owed to a highly dangerous offshore syndicate and exposed the specific illegal shell accounts he used to hide his financial ruin from the State Oversight Committee. I watched the arrogant color drain entirely from his face as the brutal reality of his exposure settled heavily over his shoulders. I offered him a brutally simple, non-negotiable ultimatum. He could either pick up his phone right now and lift every single fraudulent regulatory hold on my commercial freight trucks, or I would personally deliver that exact folder to the federal authorities and the local press syndicates before noon. I demanded that he immediately release my logistics routes and formally hand over the encrypted digital wire transfers, proving Charles Whitcomb had bribed him to execute the blockade. Miller began to sweat profusely, stammering a pathetic, broken defense as his political career evaporated before his eyes. He realized he was not dealing with a helpless truck driver, but a corporate predator who possessed the capital to utterly destroy his life. His trembling hands reached into his golf bag, retrieving an encrypted flash drive containing the illicit banking records. He handed over the physical evidence of Charles Whitcomb's bribery and frantically dialed his state dispatcher to lift the commercial freezes. I secured the flash drive in my pocket, leaving the disgraced commissioner to choke on the bitter ashes of his own corruption. Charles Whitcomb, desperate and cornered by the failure of his transportation blockade, scrambled to retain his crumbling empire. He He convened an emergency meeting of his executive board of directors at the towering Whitcomb corporate headquarters in Manhattan. The heavy mahogany doors of the primary conference room sealed shut against the panicked whispers of the remaining staff. Charles stood at the head of the massive obsidian table, sweating through his custom-tailored suit. He understood that my legal team was finalizing the formal transition of his corporate assets under the conversion clause. He needed a devastating immediate countermeasure to survive the week. He planned to aggressively utilize a deeply buried corporate loophole to initiate a massive hostile dilution of his company's private shares. By artificially flooding the market with millions of new unauthorized shares, he calculated he could systematically dilute my newly acquired 80% ownership stake down to a meaningless fraction. He intended to forcefully push my logistics corporation out of his boardroom entirely before the federal regulators could finalize my hostile takeover. He believed his hand-picked board of directors would blindly follow his command to save their own lucrative executive positions. He relied on their absolute loyalty to execute this illegal corporate maneuver. He assumed I was currently distracted managing my recovering daughter and my newly reclaimed grandson in Chicago. He completely failed to ever realize that I had actually already anticipated his desperate final boardroom strategy long before my private jet had even left the airport runway tarmac. Charles paced the length of the executive boardroom, projecting a false aura of absolute aristocratic confidence to soothe the mounting terror of his loyal board members. He slammed his hands against the polished obsidian table, demanding their immediate, unquestioning compliance with his highly illegal share dilution strategy. He aggressively assured the panicked executives that the sudden federal raid on his Long Island estate was nothing more than a temporary, highly orchestrated legal misunderstanding. He publicly dismissed my entire logistics empire, loudly claiming I was merely a foolish, uneducated truck driver who had stumbled blindly into a convenient legal loophole. He mocked my faded canvas jacket and my scuffed work boots, insisting that a man of my rugged blue-collar background lacked the fundamental intellect required to successfully execute a complex corporate takeover. He promised the board that my aggressive legal strike would instantly collapse under the sheer weight of their combined aristocratic wealth and generational influence. Charles signaled his chief financial officer to distribute the heavily forged dilution orders to the seated executives. He retrieved an expensive gold fountain pen from his breast pocket, dramatically unscrewing the cap to formalize his desperate counterattack. He instructed the board to sign the document simultaneously, assuring them that this synchronized maneuver would permanently sever my legal leverage and restore their absolute commercial dominance over the industry. He believed his sophisticated manipulation of the corporate bylaws would completely blindside my legal team. He stood at the absolute precipice of a massive coordinated financial crime, deeply convinced that his elite pedigree elevated him entirely above the reach of standard federal consequences. His gold pen hovered mere inches above the signature line of the primary dilution mandate, completely oblivious to the impending ruin, walking directly down the hallway toward his sanctuary. He prepared to sign the paperwork. The heavy double doors of the executive boardroom swung open with a resounding, violent crash that completely shattered the tense silence of the room. I walked straight into the hostile corporate sanctuary without a single word of prior announcement, wearing my faded work jacket and muddy boots. Harvey followed closely behind me with the lethal precision of a seasoned apex predator. He immediately pushed the heavy oak doors entirely shut, sliding the solid brass deadbolt firmly into place with a sharp, echoing click. He effectively locked the highest-ranking executives of Whitcomb Real Estate Holdings inside the room, with the man who now legally owned their entire corporate existence. Several board members gasped audibly, dropping their expensive pens in sheer panic as they recognized my face from the disastrous gala. Charles Whitcomb froze completely, the color draining rapidly from his aristocratic face as his gold fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers. I did not raise my voice to demand their absolute attention, and I did not acknowledge their collective outrage. I marched directly to the head of the massive obsidian conference table, completely ignoring the frantic protests of the chief financial officer. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket and retrieved the thick, encrypted flash drive I had just violently extracted from the corrupt transportation commissioner. I tossed the digital drive directly onto the polished table, allowing it to slide smoothly across the dark glass until it struck the base of Charles's coffee cup. I pulled out a separate stack of printed financial dossiers provided by my legal team. I slammed the heavy pile of authenticated banking records directly over his fraudulent share dilution mandates, crushing his desperate corporate maneuver under the undeniable weight of his own extensive and deeply hidden criminal history. I projected my voice across the locked boardroom with absolute uncompromising authority, demanding the complete attention of every single seated executive. I brutally exposed Charles Whitcomb to the very men and women he relied upon to sustain his fraudulent empire. I did not merely accuse him of attempting to steal my daughter's trust fund to salvage his failing real estate acquisitions. I revealed the deeply hidden, cancerous truth eating away at the very foundation of their massive corporate portfolio. I detailed exactly how Charles had systematically embezzled millions of dollars directly from his own primary commercial investors over the past 5 years. I explained that he had illicitly funneled their highly secure capital into untraceable offshore shell accounts, specifically to cover his own catastrophic underground gambling debts. The authenticated banking dossiers I slammed onto the table contained the precise routing numbers, the forged executive signatures, and the undeniable proof of his severe fiduciary betrayal. I informed the horrified board members that Charles had just attempted to dilute their personal shares to further shield his massive financial crimes from imminent federal discovery. The absolute loyalty Charles had arrogantly relied upon evaporated instantly in the suffocating air of the locked room. The elite executives realized they were currently staring down the barrel of severe federal prison sentences for corporate complicity, driven by pure, unadulterated self-preservation. The board members immediately turned their collective fury against their disgraced patriarch. The chief financial officer furiously initiated an emergency unscripted corporate motion to remove him from power. In a matter of brutal seconds, the panicked executives voted entirely unanimously to permanently strip Charles Whitcomb of his prestigious CEO title and forcefully expel him from the corporate board. I stood in absolute silence, watching his generational empire completely crumble into utter dust before my very eyes. The corporate boardroom coup was absolute and irreversible. The Whitcomb family was now officially destitute. Their primary bank accounts were frozen by federal regulators, their luxury vehicles were impounded, and their generational social standing was completely annihilated. They had plummeted from the pinnacle of high society to the harsh pavement of reality in less than 48 hours. I returned to my corporate headquarters in Atlanta to resume my standard logistical operations. My focus shifted to ensuring Alicia and my grandsons were recovering peacefully in our heavily guarded family estate. The dust of my hostile takeover had barely settled when my executive assistant notified me of an unexpected and highly aggressive visitor. Victoria Whitcomb had bypassed the lower security checkpoints and marched directly into my private reception area. She demanded an immediate confidential meeting with me. She was no longer draped in dark sapphire gowns or heavy diamond necklaces. She wore a simple unbranded coat, and her perfectly styled hair looked frantic and disheveled. The arrogant matriarch who had publicly humiliated me at her glittering gala was now standing squarely in my domain. She had flown across the entire country, using whatever meager funds she could scrape together just to confront the man who orchestrated her ruin. I instructed my assistant to open the doors and let her in. I wanted to see exactly what kind of desperate poison a cornered aristocrat would attempt to spit when stripped of all her unearned power and protective wealth. Victoria stormed into my spacious office and slammed her leather purse onto my polished mahogany desk. She did not offer a polite greeting or acknowledge the severe shift in our power dynamic. She immediately launched into a vicious, calculated attempt at blackmail. She pulled a digital tablet from her bag and thrust the glowing screen directly into my line of sight. The device played a heavily doctored video clip of Alicia engaging in a loud, seemingly violent argument with Blake. The footage had been maliciously edited out of context to manufacture a completely false narrative. Victoria claimed the video proved my daughter was an unstable, dangerous mother who frequently exhibited violent psychotic episodes. She proudly announced that she had already contacted several major tabloid journalists and high-profile media syndicates in New York. She threatened to leak the manipulated footage to the national press by the end of the business day if I did not comply with her outrageous demands. She intended to completely destroy Alicia's public reputation and drag my logistics empire into a massive, scandalous media circus. She leaned across my desk, her eyes wide with frantic, toxic desperation. She demanded the immediate legal return of her sprawling Long Island estate and a full reinstatement of her husband's corporate shares in exchange for her permanent silence. She genuinely believed this fabricated digital weapon gave her the ultimate leverage to reverse the catastrophic financial destruction I had just inflicted upon her entire lineage. She smiled a cruel, jagged smile, convinced she had finally cornered me. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, waiting for me to panic and surrender to her aristocratic extortion. She assumed a father would instantly sacrifice his wealth to protect his daughter from widespread public humiliation. I listened to her entire venomous monologue without showing a single trace of emotion. I did not raise my voice in anger, and I did not attempt to defend my daughter against her pathetic, fabricated accusations. I maintained the exact same cold, impenetrable silence that had already dismantled her husband and her son. A man who controls billions in corporate assets does not negotiate with desperate terrorists inside his own fortress. I allowed her to finish her aggressive rant, letting the heavy silence of the room suffocate her false confidence. I slowly reached my right hand under the thick edge of my mahogany desk and deliberately pressed a concealed security button. A faint low chime echoed softly from the overhead speakers. I looked directly into Victoria's eyes and systematically shattered her final illusion of control. I calmly informed her that she had just committed severe federal extortion and attempted blackmail within a room heavily equipped with state-of-the-art corporate security recording devices. I explained that my entire executive suite featured high-definition audio and visual surveillance systems designed specifically to document high-level corporate negotiations and prevent espionage. I pointed toward the discreet, almost invisible camera lenses embedded seamlessly into the ceiling molding above her head. I told her that every single word of her explicit threat, including her admission of doctoring footage and coordinating with tabloid journalists, was currently uploading to my secure cloud servers. I watched the triumphant smirk melt off her face, instantly replaced by a horrifying realization of her own monumental stupidity. She had voluntarily walked into an impregnable trap and handed me the exact legal ammunition required to lock her in a federal prison cell alongside her corrupt son. I opened the top drawer of my desk and retrieved a crisp, pre-drafted non-disclosure agreement prepared earlier by Harvey. I slid the thick legal document across the polished wood, positioning it directly in front of her trembling hands. I placed a heavy steel pen beside the signature line. I outlined her final non-negotiable ultimatum with absolute ruthless clarity. I ordered her to sign the document immediately legally, relinquishing any right to ever speak about Alicia, my grandsons, or my logistics corporation for the rest of her natural life. I warned her that if she refused to sign, or if she ever attempted to contact another journalist, I would instantly forward the pristine security footage of her extortion attempt to the federal prosecutor overseeing her son's active criminal case. I promised to ensure the presiding judge buried her under a mountain of severe felony charges that would guarantee she spent her remaining years wearing a standard prison uniform instead of custom designer gowns. Victoria stared at the binding contract, her breath hitching in her throat as the devastating reality of her absolute defeat crushed her entirely. She lacked the fundamental resilience to fight a battle she could not simply buy her way out of. Her hands shook violently as she picked up the steel pen and hastily scrawled her signature across the final legal pages. She dropped the pen as if it were burning hot iron. She snatched her leather purse from the desk and fled my office without uttering another word. She ran down the corporate hallway as a completely broken woman, leaving behind the absolute certainty that the Whitcomb family had been permanently erased from our lives. The devastating loss of their corporate empire and Victoria's humiliating retreat did not entirely crush Blake Whitcomb's dangerous arrogance. Facing decades in a federal penitentiary for his extensive financial crimes, Blake secured his temporary freedom through highly illicit means. The frozen status of the Whitcomb banking accounts forced him to seek capital outside the standard legal channels. My security network intercepted communications, revealing that Blake had borrowed a massive sum of cash from a ruthless underground lending syndicate operating out of New Jersey to post his exorbitant federal bail. He traded his physical freedom for a lethal high-interest debt he could never possibly repay through legitimate avenues. Finding himself entirely cornered by the federal authorities and the criminal underworld, Blake initiated a desperate scorched earth legal strategy. He erroneously believed that controlling his heirs would somehow provide him the ultimate negotiating leverage to force me into surrendering his stolen corporate shares. He weaponized the only remaining tool he possessed, He filed a vicious emergency motion in the Manhattan family court system. He formally petitioned a highly sympathetic judge to grant him absolute uncontested physical and legal custody of both of my grandsons, completely bypassing standard mediation protocols. I intended to drag my daughter back into the suffocating nightmare she had just escaped, using the innocent children as desperate disposable bargaining chips to salvage his rapidly collapsing life. Harvey alerted me to the severe escalation, immediately forwarding the digital court filings directly to my secure terminal in Atlanta. Blake had retained a notoriously aggressive family law attorney who specialized in destroying the character of opposing spouses. This attorney submitted a fresh, heavily fabricated legal dossier to the presiding family court judge. The sprawling document contained a brand new set of completely falsified psychiatric evaluations, signed by the exact same corrupt private doctor who had initiated the original fraudulent hold. The newly minted medical report aggressively claimed that Alicia's apparent mental stability in Chicago was nothing more than a temporary, highly deceptive illusion, masking a severe underlying psychosis. The corrupt doctor officially testified on paper that my daughter posed an imminent, lethal threat to the physical safety of her two young children. Blake's lawyer weaponized this fraudulent medical perspective to paint Alicia as a deeply unstable, violent woman who had kidnapped her own sons and fled across state lines to hide within my heavily guarded compound. The strategy relied entirely on the lingering, powerful bias of the Whitcomb family name within the elite New York judicial circuits. The malicious tactic worked exactly as Blake had calculated. The presiding judge, deeply alarmed by the severe medical warnings presented by a supposedly reputable Manhattan psychiatrist, bypassed the standard legal waiting periods entirely. The court issued a mandatory summons and scheduled an immediate emergency custody hearing for the very next morning. The judge threatened to dispatch state authorities to physically extract my grandsons from our care if Alicia failed to appear and defend her basic maternal competency in a public courtroom. Blake essentially created a flawless legal trap designed to force us back into his geographical territory, assuming his purchased medical authority would easily overpower our truthful narrative. The arrival of the mandatory court summons struck Alicia with the devastating force of a physical blow. I found my brilliant daughter pacing the length of our heavily secured living room, her breath hitching as sheer unadulterated panic threatened to consume her hard-earned progress. She clutched the printed legal documents in her shaking hands, her eyes wide with the absolute terror of losing her children to the man who had treated her like disposable trash. She expressed a profound, deeply ingrained fear that the notoriously corrupt family court system would blindly side with Blake's polished, wealthy facade over her own truthful testimony. She knew that high society judges frequently deferred to the expensive, prestigious letterheads of elite Manhattan medical practitioners, completely ignoring the gritty reality of the victims standing before them. I walked across the room and placed a firm, grounding hand on her trembling shoulder, instantly halting her frantic pacing. I did not offer her empty platitudes or generic words of comfort. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and delivered an absolute, unbreakable promise. I assured her that we would attend the emergency hearing in New York and completely obliterate the very foundation of her husband's malicious legal strategy. I explained that Blake had made a catastrophic tactical error by relying on the exact same corrupt medical professional to forge a second set of fraudulent documents. I told Alicia to stay in the secure house with her sons and focus entirely on her own peace of mind. I promised my daughter that I would personally track down the corrupt psychiatrist and violently dismantle the final weapon Blake dared to aim at our family. I assured her that the arrogant doctor would soon deeply regret selling his medical license to a desperate bankrupt aristocrat. I immediately boarded my private jet and flew directly back into the hostile territory of New York City, coordinating the tactical strike with Harvey while still airborne. Harvey utilized our massive corporate intelligence network to trace the digital signature of the newly submitted psychiatric evaluations. He rapidly isolated the exact physical location of the corrupt doctor's highly exclusive private medical clinic, tucked away in the wealthy Upper East Side of Manhattan. We arrived at the sleek glass building just as the heavy rain of a turbulent evening began to wash over the crowded city streets. We bypassed the elegant reception lobby entirely and navigated our black SUV down into the dimly lit subterranean executive parking garage. Our intelligence indicated that the corrupt doctor was already exhibiting signs of massive panic. The sudden federal arrest of Blake Whitcomb had severely spooked the arrogant psychiatrist, alerting him to the catastrophic danger of his illegal medical conspiracy. Harvey intercepted a secure flight manifest, showing the doctor had hastily booked a one-way first-class ticket to a non-extradition country, departing later that very night. He was desperately attempting to abandon his lucrative practice and flee the federal jurisdiction before the authorities could connect him to the massive medical fraud. We slowly cruised down the concrete aisles of the underground garage and spotted the terrified doctor aggressively shoving heavy leather suitcases into the trunk of his expensive imported sports car. He was moving with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a cornered criminal, realizing his time had completely run out. I instructed my driver to accelerate smoothly and position our massive armored SUV horizontally across the narrow concrete exit lane. I effectively trapped the fleeing doctor inside his own private parking sanctuary, entirely cutting off his only physical avenue of escape. I stepped out of the heavy armored SUV into the damp, echoing concrete of the subterranean parking garage. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the sheer terror, paralyzing the corrupt psychiatrist trapped inside his expensive imported sports car. He frantically slammed his palm against the central locking console, ensuring all four doors of his vehicle were sealed tight against my approach. He stared at my faded canvas jacket and heavy work boots with wide, panicked eyes, assuming a violent physical assault was imminent. He fumbled desperately for his cell phone, his trembling fingers struggling to dial the local authorities. I did not rush toward his window or shout empty threats through the reinforced glass. I simply walked forward with a slow, deliberate pace, stopping mere inches from his driver's side door. Harvey remained seated in the passenger side of our vehicle, utilizing a specialized digital encryption bypass tool developed by my corporate security division. The psychiatrist pressed his phone to his ear, waiting for the emergency dispatcher to answer. A sudden sharp electronic chirp echoed through the gurge. The flashing amber lights of the sports car blinked twice. The heavy internal locking mechanisms disengaged simultaneously with a loud, synchronized click. Harvey had successfully overridden the luxury vehicle's remote security mainframe, entirely stripping the arrogant doctor of his final physical barrier. The psychiatrist dropped his phone into his lap, realizing that standard police intervention could not protect him from the relentless corporate predator standing directly outside his unlocked door. I reached out and pulled the heavy car door wide open, letting the cold garage air flood the pristine leather interior of his sanctuary. I grabbed the psychiatrist by the lapel of his tailored designer suit and hoisted him firmly out of his driver's seat. I did not strike him or resort to the crude physical violence he clearly expected from a man of my rugged appearance. True power does not require bruised knuckles or shattered bones. True power is the absolute, surgical dismantling of a man's entire livelihood. I shoved him roughly against the concrete pillar adjacent to his vehicle, forcing him to stand at full attention. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my work jacket and withdrew a thick certified commercial folio. I slapped the heavy stack of banking documents directly against his chest, forcing his shaking hands to grip the paperwork. I instructed him to look closely at the primary ledger pages. I explained that growing up on the brutal loading docks of Chicago taught me how to identify a man drowning in his own greed. My forensic accounting team had spent the last 3 hours tracing the intricate web of his private finances. I revealed that his elite Manhattan medical clinic was actively failing, suffocating under massive operational deficits and severe malpractice insurance premiums. I informed him that my logistics corporation had just aggressively purchased the entire debt portfolio tied directly to his medical license and his commercial real estate lease. I was no longer merely the angry grandfather of the children he had helped steal. I was now his sole primary creditor, holding absolute legal authority to collapse his entire medical practice and auction his personal and professional assets before the morning sunrise arrived. The psychiatrist stared blankly at the catastrophic financial ledgers in his trembling hands, the blood draining completely from his aristocratic face. He realized his expensive, meticulously planned escape to a non-extradition country was entirely futile because I already owned the very foundation of his wealth. I stepped closer, projecting a low-lethal authority that left absolutely no room for negotiation or denial. I presented him with a brutally simple, non-negotiable ultimatum that would decide the rest of his natural life. I pulled a sleek digital audio recorder from my pocket and held it firmly between us. I demanded that he immediately press the record button and deliver a full, unedited verbal confession, detailing his exact participation in Blake Whitcomb's malicious legal conspiracy. I required him to explicitly state that he had willfully fabricated my daughter's severe psychiatric evaluation without ever conducting a single physical or psychological examination. I promised him that if he delivered a comprehensive confession, I would allow him to walk away from this cold concrete garage with his physical freedom intact. I then laid out the severe alternative. I warned him that if he refused to speak, or if he attempted to minimize his direct involvement, I would instantly execute the corporate liquidation clauses within his debt portfolio. I would seize his private clinic, freeze his remaining personal banking accounts, and hand over the undeniable evidence of his medical forgery directly to the Federal Medical Licensing Board. I assured him the presiding federal authorities would revoke his medical license permanently and ensure he spent the next 2 decades occupying a sterile concrete cell for orchestrating the fraudulent kidnapping of my innocent, helpless grandsons. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the dark exit ramp, fully comprehending the inescapable trap. The heavy weight of his impending financial and professional destruction entirely crushed the corrupt doctor's remaining arrogance. He collapsed onto the cold, damp concrete floor of the parking garage, his expensive tailored suit soaking up the dirty puddles left by the evening storm. He buried his face in his hands and wept with the pathetic, hollow desperation of a man stripped of all his unearned privilege. He reached out with a violently shaking hand and grasped the small digital audio recorder I held before him. He pressed the red activation button and began to speak in a rapid, terrified whisper. He confessed clearly into the microphone that Blake Whitcomb had approached him directly in his private office precisely 4 days before my daughter was forcefully exiled to Chicago. He admitted that Blake had offered him a massive, untraceable cash bribe of exactly $100,000 to completely fabricate the emergency medical conservatorship documents. He explicitly confirmed that he had never spoken a single word to Alicia, nor had he ever reviewed any legitimate medical history indicating a severe postpartum psychotic break. He acknowledged that the entire psychiatric evaluation was a malicious, weaponized fiction designed solely to strip my daughter of her maternal rights and bypass the financial security protocols of her massive hidden trust fund. I stood silently over his broken figure, allowing the recorder to capture every single damning syllable of his absolute surrender. When he finally finished speaking, I took the device from his trembling fingers and secured it safely inside the inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I turned my back on the sobbing psychiatrist without offering a single word of parting comfort. I climbed back into the armored passenger seat of my waiting vehicle. I had successfully acquired the ultimate undeniable weapon required to completely obliterate Blake's desperate custody filing in the Manhattan family courtroom. The morning of the emergency custody hearing arrived with a heavy, suffocating tension that settled over the polished mahogany benches of the Manhattan family courtroom. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors, with Alicia deliberately matching her steady, unyielding pace. She did not tremble, and she did not look at the floor. She sat beside me at the defense table, keeping her spine perfectly straight and her chin raised with absolute undeniable dignity. Across the aisle, Blake Whitcomb sat comfortably at the plaintiff table, flanked by 3 highly paid corporate attorneys, and he wore a meticulously tailored charcoal gray designer suit, chosen specifically to project the flawless image of a concerned, heartbroken, aristocratic father. He arranged his facial expression into a mask of deep manufactured sorrow, attempting to manipulate the optics of the courtroom before the proceedings even officially began. He whispered quietly to his lead counsel, occasionally casting a look of profound, fabricated pity toward our side of the room. He fully expected us to cower under the immense, intimidating weight of his generational wealth and his purchased legal authority. He assumed my daughter would crumble into a weeping, hysterical mess the moment the judge took the bench, perfectly fulfilling the deranged narrative he had constructed. He believed he had already won the battle simply by forcing us into his elite territorial domain. On had no idea that we were not walking into a defensive slaughter. We were stepping onto a perfectly prepared execution block that I had built exclusively for his absolute destruction. The presiding judge struck her wooden gavel against the sounding block, calling the emergency hearing to immediate order. Blake's lead attorney stood up immediately, launching into a vicious, highly orchestrated character assassination designed to completely obliterate Alicia's maternal competency. He paced aggressively back and forth across the polished courtroom floor, painting a horrific, terrifying picture of a dangerously unstable woman who had suffered a massive, violent psychotic collapse. He utilized aggressive, dramatic hand gestures to emphasize the supposed severity of her mental deterioration, projecting his voice loudly so every spectator in the public gallery could hear his toxic narrative. He approached the elevated judicial bench and dramatically submitted the brand new set of heavily falsified psychiatric evaluations, presenting the fraudulent paperwork as absolute indisputable medical fact. The attorney pointed a sharp, accusing finger directly at Alicia, claiming she had maliciously kidnapped her own newborn infant and fled across state lines to hide within my heavily fortified compound in Chicago. He explicitly warned the judge that my daughter posed an imminent lethal threat to the physical safety of her 2 young children if she were allowed to maintain unsupervised access for even another hour. He demanded the immediate emergency transfer of full legal and physical custody back to his client, portraying Blake as the sole stable protective parent, capable of shielding the children from harm. The judge reviewed the fraudulent medical dossier with a deep concerned frown, clearly alarmed by the severe clinical warnings explicitly detailed on the prestigious Manhattan Clinic letterhead. Blake watched the judge's reaction with a smug, deeply concealed satisfaction, entirely convinced that his expensive legal theatricality had successfully secured his victory. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms with the relaxed posture of a man who believes he has flawlessly manipulated the very scales of justice to serve his own greed. The presiding judge set the fraudulent medical dossier down on her heavy desk and turned her strict assessing gaze directly toward our side of the courtroom. She formally addressed the defense, demanding to know if we possessed any immediate counter-arguments or mitigating medical evidence to challenge the severe clinical allegations just presented. Harvey stood up from his seat beside Alicia with the calm, lethal grace of a seasoned apex predator preparing to strike. He buttoned his bespoke suit jacket and walked deliberately toward the center of the courtroom floor, radiating an absolute, uncompromising legal authority that instantly commanded the room. He did not waste time delivering a defensive opening statement or attempting to gently debunk the opposing counsel's dramatic narrative. He approached the elevated wooden bench and formally requested immediate judicial permission to submit a brand new, highly classified piece of digital evidence into the official court registry. Harvey announced in a sharp, echoing voice that the defense possessed undeniable audio proof that directly and permanently contradicted the plaintiff's entire medical foundation. Blake's attorney immediately leaped to his feet, shouting loud, frantic objections across the courtroom, claiming the defense was attempting an illegal, unverified ambush tactic. Harvey ignored the frantic protests completely, maintaining direct eye contact with the presiding judge. He explicitly clarified that the digital file contained a direct, unedited verbal confession from the exact same private psychiatrist whose signature currently authenticated the plaintiff's emergency medical dossier. He stated clearly that the audio recording would prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the severe psychiatric evaluations were nothing more than a malicious, financially motivated forgery. The sudden revelation sucked the air entirely out of the courtroom, completely silencing the opposing counsel. The judge raised her hand, halting all further objections, and leaned forward with intense, sharpened interest. The presiding judge firmly overruled the frantic, escalating objections from the plaintiff's legal team and officially authorized the immediate submission of our digital evidence. She ordered the courtroom bailiff to connect our audio equipment directly to the central judicial speaker system. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket and retrieved the sleek digital recorder I had extracted from the terrified doctor in the underground parking garage. I placed the small metal device onto the polished mahogany defense table, feeling the cold, undeniable weight of absolute justice resting beneath my fingertips. I did not look at Blake as I deliberately pressed the red playback button. The sharp, terrified whisper of the corrupt Manhattan psychiatrist instantly filled the entirely silent courtroom, echoing loudly through the overhead speakers for every single person to hear. The doctor confessed with brutal, unsparing clarity that Blake Whitcomb had personally paid him a massive, untraceable cash bribe of exactly $100,000 to completely fabricate the emergency medical documents. The recording captured the psychiatrist explicitly admitting that he had never conducted a single physical or psychological examination of Alicia, entirely inventing the severe postpartum psychotic break to facilitate a hostile financial maneuver. The absolute, Undeniable proof of the criminal medical conspiracy laid entirely bare in the suffocating silence of the courtroom, completely obliterating the false, aristocratic narrative. Blake Whitcomb's polished, heartbroken facade shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. The devastating realization that his flawless legal trap had just morphed into a highly public federal execution hit him with the force of a physical blow. He leaped out of his leather chair in a sudden blind panic, knocking the heavy wooden seat violently backward onto the floor. His tailored suit could no longer hide the terrified cornered thief exposed underneath. Blake Whitcomb staggered backward, kicking his heavy wooden chair across the polished courtroom floor as the psychiatrist's recorded confession echoed into absolute silence. His meticulously crafted aristocratic facade disintegrated, completely replaced by the frantic, unhinged desperation of a cornered predator. He slammed his hands onto the plaintiff table and screamed at the presiding judge, his face flushed a violent crimson. He wildly claimed the audio file was a highly sophisticated, maliciously fabricated deepfake manufactured by my corporate intelligence team to illegally frame him. He pointed a trembling finger at me, shouting that a retired, uneducated truck driver lacked the capacity to secure legitimate medical evidence. He demanded the judge dismiss the recording entirely and proceed with the immediate transfer of his children. The judge did not indulge his pathetic theatrical display. She slammed her heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp, resounding crack that instantly silenced his frantic rant. She looked down at Blake with an expression of pure, unadulterated judicial disgust. She explicitly informed him that the court possessed the technological means to authenticate digital evidence within minutes, rendering his desperate deepfake defense entirely useless. She formally announced that the court recognized the undeniable validity of the bribery confession. Without hesitation, she picked up her pen and aggressively struck the entire fraudulent psychiatric dossier from the official court registry. She legally obliterated the very foundation of Blake's malicious custody petition, leaving him standing completely exposed and stripped of all his purchased legal protection. Harvey did not allow Blake a single moment to recover from the devastating judicial ruling. My brilliant corporate attorney stood perfectly straight at the defense table and turned his head slightly toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. He delivered a single sharp nod. The heavy wooden doors swung open immediately, revealing two uniformed New York police officers stepping into the aisle with absolute uncompromising authority. The sudden appearance of armed law enforcement officers in a civil family court proceeding caused a massive ripple of shocked whispers throughout the public gallery. Blake's highly paid defense attorneys instinctively backed away from their own client, desperately attempting to distance themselves from the catastrophic legal fallout they now recognized was entirely unavoidable. They realized they had unknowingly submitted forged federal documents to a sitting judge, placing their own lucrative careers in severe immediate jeopardy. The presiding judge focused her strict, unyielding gaze directly on the terrified plaintiff standing before her bench. She declared in a booming, authoritative voice that the family court system would never tolerate the malicious weaponization of psychiatric medicine to facilitate the kidnapping of innocent children. She informed Blake that his deliberate submission of heavily fabricated medical evaluations constituted a severe, undeniable act of criminal perjury. She reached for a fresh stack of official legal documents resting on her elevated desk. She picked up her pen and rapidly signed a highly prioritized bench warrant, right there on the spot. She formally authorized Blake's immediate arrest for severe medical fraud, grand larceny, and criminal extortion. She handed the freshly signed execution orders directly to the court bailiff, signaling the absolute end of Blake's privileged, untouchable existence. The arrogant ear realized his stolen money could no longer buy his freedom. The two uniformed police officers marched aggressively down the center aisle of the courtroom and flanked Blake Whitcomb on both sides. They grabbed his arms with firm, unyielding grips, forcefully twisting them behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed loudly across the completely silent room. The reality of his physical capture finally broke the last remaining shreds of his aristocratic composure. He fought against the officers with the chaotic, uncoordinated energy of a desperate man screaming vicious curses directly at me as they dragged him away from the plaintiff table. He shrieked that a filthy, uneducated truck driver had no right to destroy his elite generational legacy. I maintained absolute, impenetrable silence, watching his pathetic departure without displaying a single ounce of emotion. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off his frantic shouting and restoring complete order to the judicial sanctuary. The presiding judge turned her attention back to Alicia, her strict expression softening into a look of profound, genuine professional respect. She formally apologized to my daughter for the terrifying ordeal the court system had inadvertently forced her to endure. She picked up her gavel and delivered the final undeniable legal ruling that permanently secured our family's future. The judge officially granted Alicia absolute sole legal and physical custody of both of her young sons, effective immediately. She went a massive step further, deliberately executing a permanent termination of Blake's parental rights, entirely citing his extreme documented capacity for severe psychological abuse and child endangerment. The devastating legal severing ensured that Blake and his completely bankrupt family could never legally approach my daughter or my grandsons for the rest of their natural lives. My silent adjustment was legally finalized. The sharp strike of the judicial gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the absolute end of the legal nightmare. Alicia let out a shuddering gasp, the immense weight of the past week finally lifting from her exhausted shoulders. She turned in her chair and threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a fierce, desperate embrace right there in the middle of the defense table. She buried her face against the rough canvas of my work jacket and wept with profound, overwhelming relief. I held my brilliant daughter tightly, placing a gentle grounding hand on the back of her head to silently assure her that the monsters were permanently vanquished. The immediate terrifying threat posed by the Whitcomb family was entirely neutralized, locked away behind steel bars and impenetrable legal barriers. However, as I held her shaking frame, I recognized that achieving a courtroom victory was only the first step in a much longer war. Blake had systematically chipped away at her self-worth for years, convincing her she was fragile and dependent on his aristocratic approval. I knew we had to completely rebuild her shattered confidence before she could truly reclaim her fierce independence. I pulled back slightly, looking directly into her tear-stained eyes with uncompromising paternal pride. I told her that she had survived a brutal financial war and proven her immense resilience to the world. I informed her that the days of hiding her intellect behind the shadow of arrogant men were officially over. I offered her a highly demanding operational oversight position within my massive logistics empire. I challenged her to step onto the commercial battlefield by my side and learn how to wield the massive invisible wealth I had built exclusively for her ultimate empowerment. Alicia accepted my offer before the gavel echoes even faded from the Manhattan courtroom. She packed her few remaining belongings and flew back to Atlanta, with me leaving the wreckage of her previous life behind. However, I did not bring my daughter into my corporate headquarters to hand her a lucrative executive title or a corner office with a panoramic view of the city skyline. I understood that Blake had systematically dismantled her confidence by keeping her insulated in a gilded cage of unearned privilege. To truly rebuild her shattered armor, she needed to understand the absolute foundation of my logistics empire. On her first morning, I did not give her a tailored business suit or a sleek corporate laptop. I handed her a pair of heavy steel-toed work boots, thick leather gloves, and a standard reflective safety vest. I drove her directly to the largest, loudest, and most grueling distribution warehouse in our entire southern network. I walked her onto the massive concrete loading docks, where the deafening roar of diesel engines and the relentless shouting of freight coordinators filled the heavy air. I introduced her to the floor foreman simply as a new logistics trainee, explicitly forbidding any mention of her actual lineage. I told Alicia that true power is never inherited through a signature on a piece of paper. True power is forged by understanding the weight of the cargo, the sweat of the laborers, and the absolute necessity of mutual respect on the concrete floor. Alicia struggled immensely during her brutal first week on the active freight lines. I monitored her progress discreetly from the upper management offices, watching her navigate the harsh, unforgiving reality of blue-collar labor. Her shifts began precisely at 4 in the morning, forcing her to load heavy wooden pallets and verify massive shipping manifests long before the sun even breached the horizon. She returned to her modest apartment every single night, completely physically exhausted, her hands blistered and her muscles aching from the relentless, repetitive physical exertion. She was surrounded by hardened workers who did not care about her advanced education or her polished vocabulary. They only cared if she could pull her own weight on the shipping line. I waited for her to march into my office and demand an easier assignment. I fully expected the grueling conditions to break her resolve and force her to ask for the unearned executive privilege she was originally accustomed to. She never complained. She never asked for a single favor. Instead, Alicia tied her hair back and worked twice as hard as the men standing beside her. She began to observe the intricate, chaotic ballet of the loading docks with a profound new perspective. She saw the sheer physical toll required to move goods across the country. She finally understood the immense, grueling sacrifices I had made decades ago to build the invisible wealth she had once taken for granted. She realized that every dollar in her protected trust fund was paved with the sweat and exhaustion of the men and women currently working right beside her. The polished, fragile aristocrat was slowly dying on the concrete floor, replaced entirely by a woman forging an unbreakable spine. She was finally learning the unvarnished truth about real power. The true test of her newly forged resilience arrived in the form of an arrogant regional supply chain manager named Carlson. Carlson was a mid-level corporate climber who routinely visited the loading docks to assert his manufactured authority over the floor workers. He was a petty, insecure tyrant who masked his own professional incompetence by aggressively bullying the lower-tier employees. He immediately targeted Alicia, entirely unaware that the quiet, exhausted woman hauling freight was actually the sole heir to the entire logistics empire. Carlson barked demeaning orders at her, intentionally assigning her the most complex, disorganized shipment manifests just to watch her struggle. He publicly mocked her efficiency and insulted her intelligence in front of the entire loading crew. Alicia did not crumble under his relentless verbal abuse. She did not run to my executive office to demand his immediate termination. She absorbed his insults with a cold, calculated silence, utilizing her brilliant academic mind to quietly analyze the root cause of his aggressive behavior. She began taking detailed notes on the specific delivery routes Carlson strictly enforced. She stayed late after her grueling shifts, sitting in the break room with her heavy boots propped up, cross-referencing his dispatch schedules with the national traffic grid. She quickly identified a massive, catastrophic flaw in his regional supply chain routing. Carlson was intentionally routing trucks through heavily congested, outdated transit corridors to justify his inflated departmental budget, bleeding the company of thousands of dollars in wasted diesel fuel and severe delay penalties every single week. She understood exactly how to exploit his massive operational oversight without relying on my authority. She patiently waited for the perfect moment to execute her counterattack, allowing his unwarranted arrogance to blind him entirely to the sophisticated analytical trap she was meticulously setting behind his back. The inevitable confrontation erupted on a chaotic Friday morning when a fleet of essential delivery trucks missed their primary departure window. Carlson stormed onto the loading dock, his face flushed with anger, loudly blaming Alicia for the severe logistical failure. He pointed a finger directly at her chest, screaming that she lacked the basic mental capacity to handle simple freight distribution. Alicia did not back down or apologize for a failure she did not commit. She calmly reached into her reflective safety vest and pulled out a heavily annotated clipboard. She stepped directly into his personal space and dismantled his entire professional existence with absolute surgical precision. She spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring every single worker on the concrete floor heard her detailed operational analysis. Alicia exposed his catastrophic routing failures verbally, mapping out the massive dead miles and the specific fuel waste his incompetence generated daily. She presented a flawlessly optimized transit algorithm she had designed herself, proving her new logistical matrix would instantly save the Southern Regional Network tens of thousands of dollars before the fiscal quarter even ended. She publicly outsmarted him, humiliating the arrogant manager with her undeniable competence and superior intellect. Carlson stood completely paralyzed, his authority utterly shattered by a rookie dock worker who had just single-handedly rewritten his entire departmental protocol. I stood quietly on the elevated steel catwalk directly above the warehouse floor, watching the entire glorious execution unfold. I watched the surrounding dock workers nod in deep, genuine respect as Alicia commanded the space without relying on my wealth or my protection. I smiled a quiet, immensely proud smile in the shadows of the rafters. My daughter had completely shed her victimhood and proved her true caliber. She was finally ready to lead my empire. Following her undisputed triumph on the warehouse floor, I immediately promoted Alicia to a high-level strategic oversight position within our central corporate headquarters. She traded her heavy steel-toed boots for the sharp authority of the executive boardroom, bringing a ruthless operational efficiency she forged on the concrete loading docks. Her first primary directive was to conduct a comprehensive integration audit of the recently seized Whitcomb real estate assets. She applied her brilliant analytical mind to the sprawling financial portfolio, systematically dismantling the convoluted accounting structures Blake had built over the years. During a late-night review of the deepest corporate ledgers, she uncovered a heavily encrypted subsidiary holding company buried beneath multiple layers of offshore banking proxies. Alicia cracked the financial firewall and discovered a catastrophic vulnerability. The hidden subsidiary did not hold legitimate commercial real estate assets. It held massive amounts of toxic, highly illegal debt tied directly to a network of dangerous underground lenders. Blake had desperately borrowed millions in unregulated street capital to artificially inflate his failing properties long before he attempted to steal her trust fund. Anya had legally tethered this lethal black market debt to the very corporate entity my logistics empire had just aggressively absorbed through the conversion clause. We had unwittingly inherited a ticking financial time bomb deeply intertwined with violent criminal organizations, effectively making my legitimate business a primary target for ruthless debt collectors seeking immediate restitution. The brutal reality of Blake criminal negligence materialized less than 48 hours after Alicia identified the toxic subsidiary. The underground lenders realized the Whitcomb family was entirely bankrupt and quickly shifted their aggressive collection tactics toward the new legal owners of the corporate portfolio. They bypassed our standard communication channels and began systematically harassing my daughter. Alicia received a series of highly encrypted, terrifying emails demanding immediate, untraceable wire transfers to settle the exorbitant debts Blake had foolishly accumulated. The extortionists explicitly threatened to escalate their collection methods if she ignored their financial ultimatums. They sought to intimidate her by proving they possessed intimate knowledge of her daily schedule and the exact locations of her 2 young children. Alicia maintained her newly forged composure, refusing to succumb to the psychological terror tactics that would have shattered her just a few months prior. The criminal syndicate grew impatient with her absolute silence and escalated their aggressive campaign directly to our corporate headquarters in Atlanta. They bypassed the external security perimeter and managed to deliver a series of unmarked, highly threatening packages directly to our executive reception desk. The packages contained disturbing, undeniable proof of their reach, including surveillance photographs of our primary distribution warehouses and heavily implied threats of violent sabotage against our commercial freight fleet. They intended to paralyze our national supply chain and extort millions of dollars from our legitimate revenue streams. They operated under the assumption that a legitimate corporate entity would quietly pay the ransom to avoid violent public scandals and protect their commercial reputation. They severely underestimated the unyielding resolve of the family they were currently attempting to terrorize. I stepped directly into the line of fire the moment the threatening packages breached the walls of my corporate sanctuary. I sat across from Alicia in her executive office and looked at the surveillance photographs scattered across her polished desk. She asked me if we should simply liquidate a minor asset and pay the extortion money to ensure the absolute physical safety of our family. I rejected her proposal instantly and unequivocally. I explained to my daughter that paying a black market ransom never buys permanent security. It only signals weakness and guarantees the predators will inevitably return to drain the well dry. I took personal command of the situation, refusing to surrender a single cent of our hard-earned capital to cover the desperate mistakes of her disgraced former husband. I mobilized my elite corporate intelligence division, ordering my top cybersecurity experts to aggressively reverse engineer the encrypted extortion emails. We tore through their digital proxies and rapidly isolated the digital footprint of the illicit operation. We traced the aggressive communication network directly to a highly organized, heavily armed crime syndicate operating out of an industrial sector in northern New Jersey. I refused to engage in a shadow war or hire private mercenaries to fight a street battle. I am a businessman who operates with overwhelming calculated legal force. I summoned Harvey to my office and formulated a ruthless strategy to permanently eradicate the toxic debt without compromising the integrity of my logistics empire. We would not fight the syndicate in the dark alleys. We would crush their entire financial infrastructure using the absolute undeniable power of the federal government. I contacted a highly specialized FBI task force actively investigating organized financial crime on the East Coast. I bypassed lower-level agents and secured an immediate secure video conference with the lead federal director overseeing the New Jersey syndicate. I did not ask for standard police assistance or file a generic harassment report. I approached the federal director with the exact same ruthless negotiation tactics I utilized in corporate boardrooms. I presented an undeniable, highly lucrative proposition. I offered the FBI the complete unredacted accounting ledgers of the toxic Whitcomb subsidiary Alicia had uncovered. I explained that the ledgers contained the exact routing numbers, illicit transaction histories, and digital fingerprints required to map the syndicate's entire money laundering network. In exchange for handing them the absolute key to dismantling a major criminal enterprise, I demanded full, irrevocable legal immunity for my logistics corporation regarding the inherited subsidiary. I also required an immediate heavily armed federal protection detail for my daughter and my grandsons until the syndicate was entirely neutralized. The federal director reviewed a sample of our forensic data and recognized the monumental value of the intelligence I possessed. He accepted my terms without a single moment of hesitation, granting my company absolute legal insulation from the incoming fallout. Within 24 hours, the FBI executed a massive coordinated tactical strike against the syndicate. Heavily armed federal tactical teams breached the New Jersey headquarters, seizing servers and arresting the primary architects of the extortion ring. The illegal debt Blake had chained to our company was instantly vaporized in the federal raid, permanently severing our final terrifying connection to his criminal negligence. The federal tactical strike on the New Jersey syndicate was absolute and devastating. The massive toxic debt attached to the absorbed Whitcomb subsidiary vanished overnight, wiped clean by the ironclad federal immunity agreement I personally orchestrated. Our logistics empire remained completely insulated from the criminal fallout, securing our financial borders permanently. With all external threats effectively neutralized, the final pathetic remnant of the past attempted to claw its way back into our reality. I was sitting at my massive mahogany desk, reviewing the updated quarterly ledgers, when my secure internal communication system alerted me to an incoming call on Alicia's private line. The caller identification boldly displayed a secure federal penitentiary routing number. Blake Whitcomb was calling my daughter directly from the harsh confines of a sterile concrete cell. Facing decades in federal prison for his elaborate medical fraud and grand larceny, Blake had completely exhausted his expensive legal appeals and his entire elite network. Stripped of his custom-tailored designer suits and arrogant high society privilege, he resorted to desperate, unadulterated begging. He attempted one final pathetic display of psychological manipulation over the monitored prison phone line. He used a deliberately trembling, broken voice to plead with Alicia, begging her to deposit any available funds into his meager prison commissary account. He claimed he was starving, physically isolated, and entirely terrified by the brutal, unforgiving reality of his permanent incarceration. He expected his former wife to crumble out of deeply ingrained pity, assuming he could still pluck the strings of her empathy to secure a minor financial comfort in his utterly ruined existence. I watched the entire interaction unfold through the heavy soundproof glass walls, separating our adjacent executive suites. I deliberately chose not to intervene or attempt to sever the secure connection. Alicia needed to face this final ghost directly to permanently cement her hard-earned independence. She held the telephone receiver to her ear, listening intently to the frantic weeping pleas of the man who had previously treated her like disposable garbage. She did not shed a single tear, and she did not offer a single word of immediate comfort. As Blake desperately spun his pathetic web of manufactured misery, I saw a profound, permanent transformation settle heavily over my daughter's entire posture. She stood up from her imported leather chair, ensuring her spine was perfectly straight and unyielding. She vividly remembered the freezing, relentless rain hammering against the cracked pavement in that bleak Chicago parking lot. She remembered the absolute, suffocating terror of standing in a rundown grocery store with a declined debit card, entirely unable to purchase basic formula for her newborn infant. She remembered the agonizing hollow pain of having her 2-year-old son ruthlessly ripped from her arms under the malicious guise of a fabricated psychiatric emergency. Blake had deliberately weaponized her maternal love and aggressively attempted to erase her sanity just to secure a commercial real estate bailout. The visceral memory of that profound vulnerability did not break her resolve. It ignited a massive, unquenchable fire deep within her chest. She absorbed his desperate begging and recognized his routine for exactly what it was. It was merely the pathetic sound of a defeated predator, realizing he possessed absolutely zero leverage over his former prey. Alicia found her absolute unshakable power in the cold silence. She realized she no longer feared the arrogant aristocrat who had tormented her. She now commanded the full, undeniable authority of our logistics empire, and she was entirely immune to his transparent manipulation. Alicia did not raise her voice or stoop to his pathetic level of emotional hysteria. She spoke into the prison receiver with a cold, calculated precision that perfectly mirrored my own ruthless boardroom negotiation tactics. She explicitly told Blake that he was entirely dead to her and her innocent children. She informed him that his legal parental rights were permanently terminated by a federal judge, and his toxic name would never be spoken in the presence of Leo or little Miles ever again. She then delivered the ultimate financial death blow to his thoroughly shattered aristocratic ego. She detailed exactly how the aggressive conversion clause had systematically absorbed his failing commercial real estate portfolio. Alicia informed him that the prestigious Whitcomb generational legacy he had so arrogantly flaunted to high society had been completely erased from the National Commercial Registry. She explained that every single luxury building hidden subsidiary, an offshore holding account, once bearing his elite family name, had been entirely assimilated into the rapidly expanding Kingston logistics empire. She wanted him to spend the next 2 decades sitting in his sterile concrete prison cell, knowing that his desperate attempt to steal her protected trust fund had directly resulted in his family's absolute financial annihilation. Blake began to scream violently through the monitored phone line, his pathetic begging morphing instantly into a furious, unhinged rage as the crushing finality of her words destroyed his remaining sanity. He loudly cursed her and demanded she reverse the legal corporate assimilation immediately. Alicia did not listen to his chaotic, powerless tantrum. She simply lowered the heavy plastic receiver and pressed the red disconnection button, permanently severing the secure digital connection. She hung up the phone with a sharp echoing click, decisively cutting the toxic anchor that had previously weighed down her existence. She rendered his entire existence completely irrelevant to our thriving, unbroken family. The heavy glass doors of my executive suite slid open a few moments later. Alicia walked directly into my private office, her posture radiating an undeniable, commanding corporate authority. She no longer looked like the terrified, shivering woman I had rescued from a bleak Chicago grocery store. She looked exactly like the fiercely intelligent, unyielding executive destined to inherit a multi-billion-dollar national freight network. She walked straight toward my polished mahogany desk and reached into the pocket of her tailored business blazer. She pulled out the heavy diamond-encrusted wedding ring Blake had placed on her finger during their lavish high-society wedding ceremony. She dropped the excessively expensive piece of jewelry directly onto the center of my desk. The precious metal struck the hard wood with a dull, heavy thud, symbolizing the absolute end of her aristocratic nightmare. She looked me directly in the eyes and issued a calm, resolute directive. She asked me to have our corporate jewelers melt the entire ring down to its base raw materials. She strictly instructed me to donate the extracted gold and the highly appraised central diamond to a specialized charity funding aggressive legal defense teams for women facing severe financial abuse. She absolutely refused to keep any physical token of the false kingdom that had maliciously attempted to break her spirit. I looked at the discarded ring resting on my desk, and then up at my brilliant daughter. I did not offer any soft, sentimental speeches. I simply nodded, sweeping the jewelry into a secure steel lockbox to execute her exact command without hesitation. I saw the absolute clarity and ruthless determination shining brightly in her eyes. I knew in that precise defining moment that her grueling apprenticeship on the concrete loading docks had completed her profound transformation. The terrified victim was entirely gone. I smiled a quiet, deeply proud smile, approving her final undeniable transition into a formidable corporate leader, fully capable of ruling my empire. The physical destruction of the Whitcomb legacy was only the beginning of our ultimate victory. Alicia and I sat in my Atlanta office and reviewed the vast real estate portfolio we had aggressively absorbed. The sprawling Long Island estate stood at the very top of the asset ledger, a massive stone monument to arrogance and unearned privilege. My financial advisor strongly recommended liquidating the massive property to inject immediate capital back into our core logistics network. I rejected their proposal entirely. Selling the mansion to another arrogant billionaire would simply perpetuate the endless cycle of elite greed. Alicia proposed a significantly more devastating and poetic use for the property. She looked at the blueprints of the estate and outlined a comprehensive strategy to convert the sprawling mansion into a highly funded, heavily fortified sanctuary for mothers actively escaping domestic and financial abuse. We completely gutted the lavish ballrooms where Victoria Whitcomb once hosted her exclusive elite galas. We replaced the crystal chandeliers and antique artwork with state-of-the-art medical facilities, secure residential suites, and comprehensive legal aid offices. We utilized the massive operational budget of our logistics empire to guarantee the sanctuary would never rely on outside donations or fickle political grants. Alicia oversaw every single phase of the rapid reconstruction. She transformed a fortress built on exclusion into an impenetrable safe haven, designed exclusively for the vulnerable women society routinely discarded. We erased the Whitcomb name from the iron gates and mounted a solid bronze plaque dedicating the facility to unbroken resilience. The grand opening of the sanctuary occurred on a crisp, bright Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months after our initial hostile takeover. We did not invite high society socialites or wealthy commercial investors to celebrate the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Alicia intentionally invited a massive contingent of national press syndicates and dedicated investigative journalists to broadcast our victory across the entire country. The media arrived in droves, positioning their heavy camera equipment across the manicured lawns to document the breathtaking transformation of the notorious estate. News anchors delivered live national broadcasts detailing how the former stronghold of a disgraced federally indicted real estate family now served as a premier charity center for destitute mothers. Miles away from the glittering celebration, Charles and Victoria Whitcomb sat in absolute suffocating silence inside a cramped, dimly lit rental apartment in a decaying industrial suburb. Their frozen bank accounts and massive legal debts had forced them into the exact grinding poverty they had spent their entire lives mocking. They watched the glowing screen of a small, outdated television set as my brilliant daughter stood confidently on their former front porch. Victoria clutched a cheap stained ceramic mug, her eyes hollow and completely devoid of her former aristocratic arrogance. Charles stared at the broadcast with a broken, defeated expression, watching Alicia flawlessly articulate her mission of empowering financially abused women. They were forced to witness the ultimate undeniable proof of their absolute ruin broadcast directly into their miserable living room. The news cameras panned across the sprawling gardens they once proudly owned, now filled with the joyous laughter of children they would have previously ordered their security teams to expel. They realized their generational legacy was not just dismantled, but entirely overwritten by the very people they had arrogantly attempted to destroy. As the television crews packed their heavy equipment and the journalists filed out of the main gates, the true operational purpose of our new sanctuary officially commenced. A battered, rusting sedan pulled slowly into the sweeping circular driveway, stopping nervously near the grand entrance. A young, terrified woman stepped out into the biting wind, clutching a sleeping infant tightly against her chest. She wore a thin, torn sweater and carried a single plastic shopping bag containing all her worldly possessions. She looked up at the towering stone mansion with wide, frightened eyes, clearly expecting to be turned away or subjected to aggressive bureaucratic interrogation. Alicia did not wait for the security staff to approach the frightened mother. My daughter walked directly down the marble steps, completely ignoring the freezing wind hitting her tailored business suit. She approached the young woman with a calm, grounding authority that radiated absolute safety. Alicia removed her own heavy, expensive wool coat and wrapped it securely around the shivering mother's shoulders, shielding the sleeping infant from the harsh elements. She looked directly into the young woman's tearful eyes and assured her that she would never have to run or hide again. Alicia immediately deployed a team of specialized sanctuary lawyers to file an emergency protective order against the woman's abuser before the sun even set. She personally guided the exhausted mother through the heavy oak doors and into the welcoming warmth of the fortified facility. I watched my daughter seamlessly provide the exact sanctuary financial shielding and immediate legal defense she had been brutally denied in Chicago. The insidious, generational cycle of financial terror and domestic manipulation was officially and permanently broken right there on the front steps. I stood quietly near the towering bronze pillars of the main portico, observing my daughter orchestrate the massive charity operation with flawless grace and unyielding authority. She dispatched legal aides, directed the medical staff, and comforted terrified families without a single moment of hesitation. She operated with the lethal precision of a seasoned corporate executive and the profound empathy of a woman who had survived the absolute worst of human greed. I watched her navigate the complex logistical demands of the sanctuary, realizing that the frightened, shivering victim I had rescued from a rundown grocery store no longer existed. In her place stood a formidable, fiercely intelligent leader who possessed the strength to tear down corrupt empires and the compassion to build impenetrable fortresses for the defenseless. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace settle heavily into my chest. The brutal, exhaustive war I had waged to protect her was completely and undeniably over. My fundamental mission as a father and a protector was entirely fulfilled. I recognized that my massive logistics empire no longer required my relentless daily supervision. I walked into the temporary executive office we had established on the ground floor of the sanctuary and retrieved a thick, heavily certified legal portfolio from my leather briefcase. I placed the finalized corporate transition documents squarely onto the center of the mahogany desk. When Alicia entered the room a few minutes later, I did not offer a long, sentimental speech about passing the torch. I simply handed her a solid gold fountain pen and pointed directly to the primary signature line. I officially transferred the absolute CEO title and total operational control of our entire enterprise directly into her highly capable hands. Alicia walked into this primary executive boardroom of our Atlanta headquarters with a presence that demanded absolute silence. She did not hesitate or look to me for approval as she bypassed the standard seating and took her rightful place in the heavy leather executive chair at the head of the obsidian table. A delegation of highly influential European logistics investors sat across from her, initially expecting to negotiate with the rugged founder who had built the empire. They quickly realized they were dealing with a completely different caliber of corporate apex predator. Alicia opened the summit by projecting a massive, flawlessly optimized digital map of our newly integrated global supply chain networks. She addressed the foreign delegates with absolute unyielding confidence, articulating a highly aggressive strategy to expand our domestic freight routes directly into lucrative international markets. She completely bypassed the standard, cautious pleasantries and immediately proposed a massive transatlantic shipping alliance that would secure our absolute dominance over the eastern seaboard ports. The investors listened with rapt attention, entirely captivated by her brilliant, mathematically perfect operational matrix. She dismantled their conservative counteroffers with surgical precision, proving she understood the intricate mechanics of global trade better than men who had spent their entire lives in the industry. I sat quietly in the corner of the boardroom, watching my daughter orchestrate the complex international negotiations without a single flaw in her armor. The transition of absolute power was completely seamless and entirely undeniable. Harvey stood up from his seat beside Alicia and formally presented the finalized quarterly earnings reports to the stunned room of international delegates. He distributed the heavy certified financial dossiers detailing the massive economic surge our corporation had experienced over the past 6 months. He revealed with cold, undeniable numerical evidence that our logistics empire had officially doubled in total market value since aggressively assimilating the liquidated Whitcomb real estate assets. Alicia had not merely absorbed the sprawling commercial properties her disgraced former husband had bankrupted. She had systematically restructured them, converting massive unused metropolitan warehouses into highly lucrative automated distribution hubs that perfectly served our expanding national freight network. She explicitly proved to the entire corporate sector that she was infinitely more capable of managing a generational empire than Blake ever was. Blake had relied on fragile aristocratic privilege, arrogant entitlement, and toxic illegal debt to sustain a dying legacy that was always destined to collapse. Alicia utilized raw intelligence, brutal warehouse floor experience, and a flawless understanding of modern supply chain economics to construct an impenetrable financial fortress that generated pure, sustainable capital. The foreign investors reviewed the staggering profit margins and immediately agreed to sign the massive international expansion contracts without demanding a single operational concession. They recognized that partnering with Alicia meant aligning themselves with an unstoppable, fiercely intelligent force of nature who understood the true value of hard work. She officially closed the multi-billion-dollar summit with a firm, commanding handshake, securing our absolute financial supremacy on a global scale. The terrified, shivering woman hiding in a rundown Chicago grocery store was permanently gone, replaced entirely by a ruthless visionary corporate titan who bowed to absolutely no one. With my daughter firmly cemented at the absolute pinnacle of our corporate hierarchy, I officially transitioned into a quiet, heavily guarded retirement. I completely handed over the brutal daily operations of the freight lines and the ruthless boardroom negotiations, choosing to step entirely out of the aggressive commercial spotlight. I traded my hectic travel schedules and high-stakes corporate acquisitions for the profound grounding peace of my sprawling, heavily wooded estate in Atlanta. I spent my early mornings inside my private climate-controlled garage, restoring heavy American classic muscle cars with my own two hands. I found deep therapeutic satisfaction in stripping away rusted metal, rebuilding complex engines from scratch and polishing vintage chrome until it gleamed perfectly under the bright garage lights. It was a tangible, quiet labor that kept my hands calloused and my mind sharply focused on creation rather than destruction. My afternoons were entirely dedicated to the absolute joy of raising my two energetic grandsons. I built a massive custom wooden playground in the center of the secure backyard, ensuring Leo and little Tyson had a completely safe, impenetrable fortress to explore and grow. I pushed Leo on the heavy wooden swing set, listening to his bright, unrestrained laughter echo across the manicured lawn. I held little Tyson securely against my chest as he took his very first clumsy steps across the soft green grass, completely shielded from the malicious, aristocratic cruelty that had once threatened to consume his fragile life. We spent hours racing small toy trucks through the dirt, building impenetrable forts out of cardboard boxes and creating a lifetime of joyful, unbroken memories. I watched them thrive in the warm southern sun, completely insulated from the toxic, manipulative shadows of their disgraced biological father. I sat on the wide wrap-around porch of my Atlanta home, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, while reflecting deeply on the volatile nature of wealth and power. I recognized with absolute clarity that massive financial capital is merely a blunt, unfeeling tool. Money alone cannot purchase genuine loyalty. It cannot manufacture a strong moral compass, and it certainly cannot shield a coward from the devastating consequences of their own blinding arrogance. The Whitcomb family possessed generations of unimaginable wealth, yet they collapsed into absolute ruin because their foundation was built entirely on deceit, manipulation, and a profound lack of basic human decency. I looked out across the sprawling green yard, watching my brilliant daughter scoop Leo into her arms while balancing little Tyson on her hip. I understood that the true, lasting inheritance I had successfully passed down to my family was never the billions held securely in our corporate logistics accounts. The ultimate legacy I gave them was an unbreakable spine of resilience, a foundation of uncompromising integrity, and the fierce, undeniable courage to demand respect in any room they entered. Alicia learned how to navigate the darkest, most terrifying storms of betrayal and emerge with her head held high, entirely capable of dismantling anyone who dared to threaten her peace. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my coffee as the warm evening sun began to dip below the towering Georgia pines. The violent, chaotic war that had threatened to tear my bloodline apart was permanently replaced by a quiet, unshakable harmony. I stood up from my wooden rocking chair and walked toward my thriving, joyful family as I prepared to celebrate my 70th birthday, knowing the balance of our world was finally and flawlessly restored. The warm, thick scent of hickory smoke drifted lazily across my sprawling Atlanta's backyard, blending perfectly with the rich aroma of roasting meat. There were absolutely no massive crystal chandeliers suspended above our heads, and there were no custom-tailored tuxedos suffocating the guests. My 70th birthday celebration required absolutely none of the hollow, glittering aristocratic trappings that the Whitcomb family had relied upon to project their false superiority. I stood over the large custom steel grill I had built with my own two hands, wearing my favorite faded denim jeans and a simple cotton shirt. The lively, unrestrained sound of genuine family laughter echoed brightly across the manicured green lawn, replacing the tense, calculated whispers of high society ballrooms. Harvey sat at a wooden picnic table a few yards away, having traded his intimidating bespoke courtroom suits for a relaxed linen shirt, actively debating baseball statistics with my senior logistics managers. Alicia moved gracefully through the casual crowd of trusted friends and loyal warehouse foremen, carrying a large tray of cold drinks with a bright, entirely unburdened smile radiating across her face. Little Leo chased a brightly colored plastic ball through the soft grass, his joyful shrieks piercing the comfortable afternoon air. I flipped a rack of ribs on the hot iron grates and breathed in the absolute, undeniable reality of my success. This simple, unpretentious backyard gathering represented the ultimate unbreakable fortress I had fought so ruthlessly to protect and preserve. Alicia walked across the sunlit yard and stopped directly beside the smoking grill, holding little Miles securely against her hip. She reached into the pocket of her casual summer dress and pulled out a slightly crumpled, brightly colored piece of construction paper, folded clumsily down the middle. She handed the homemade card to me with a deep, knowing look of profound gratitude shining in her eyes. I wiped my hands on an old cloth towel and took the fragile paper, opening it carefully to reveal a chaotic, vibrant drawing crafted entirely in heavy crayon strokes. Leo had drawn a large, smiling stick figure wearing a brown jacket standing protectively over two smaller figures, representing himself and his baby brother. He had meticulously traced his own name at the very bottom, in large, uneven letters, a testament to the safe, nurturing environment his mother now provided him. I stared at the simple, childish artwork, feeling a sudden, overwhelming surge of raw emotion tighten my throat. That single inexpensive piece of folded construction paper possessed infinitely more actual value to me than the billions of dollars resting securely in my global corporate accounts. I looked up from the drawing and focused my gaze entirely on my thriving, fiercely independent daughter and the two innocent boys who would inherit our unshakable legacy. The terrified, shivering woman I had rescued from a bleak Chicago grocery store was entirely gone, completely replaced by a formidable corporate titan and a fiercely protective mother. She had reclaimed her absolute agency and built a beautiful, secure life far away from the toxic manipulation of her past. Watching her laugh freely as Leo ran up to hug her legs, I knew my brutal corporate war had secured the exact priceless victory I had initially set out to achieve. Hundreds of miles away from our joyful southern sanctuary, the absolute ruin of the Whitcomb family remained a stark, permanent reality. Charles Whitcomb, the previously untouchable patriarch who had arrogantly attempted to buy my silence with a $10,000 check, now spent his days wearing a cheap nylon vest over a worn collared shirt. Stripped entirely of his commercial real estate empire and his generational wealth, he worked 40 hours a week as a basic customer greeter at a large, impersonal retail hardware store in a decaying northern suburb. He was forced to stand by the automatic sliding doors and politely welcome the very working-class laborers he had spent his entire life actively despising. Meanwhile, Blake sat completely isolated inside a sterile, unforgiving concrete cell within a maximum security federal penitentiary. He wore a standardized rough orange jumpsuit instead of his custom-tailored designer suits, entirely stripped of his unearned aristocratic privilege and his manipulative charm. He spent his endless, monotonous days staring at cinder-block walls, suffocating under the crushing realization that his own aggressive arrogance had permanently destroyed his freedom and his lineage. They had looked at my faded canvas jacket and my scuffed leather work boots and mistakenly believed they were dealing with a helpless, uneducated peasant they could easily discard. They had foolishly mistaken my quiet humility for an inherent weakness, assuming their stolen capital provided an impenetrable shield against severe consequences. They learned too late that a quiet man often possesses the loudest authority. Their absolute financial and social annihilation served as a permanent, undeniable testament to the fatal danger of underestimating a man who refuses to boast about the lethal weapons he silently carries. I closed the grill and stepped back, allowing the younger generation to take over the distribution of the food. I walked slowly toward the edge of my sprawling property, stopping near the heavy wooden fence that bordered the thick, ancient pine trees. I leaned against the solid timber, holding a ceramic mug of strong black coffee, and allowed my mind to settle into a state of profound, absolute stillness. The violent, chaotic corporate battles and the desperate, late-night legal maneuvers were officially relegated to the past. I realized that the greatest lesson I could ever pass down to Alicia and my grandsons was not the intricate mechanics of a hostile corporate takeover or the brutal accumulation of limitless capital. I had taught them through deliberate, calculated action that true absolute power never needs to scream for attention or flaunt its existence with vulgar displays of high society wealth. The loudest men in the room are almost always the most vulnerable when their fragile illusions are finally challenged. True power is the quiet, relentless capacity to protect the people you love, and the iron resolve to entirely dismantle anyone who dares to threaten their safety. I took a slow, deep sip of my bitter black coffee, feeling the warm liquid settle comfortably in my chest. I watched the bright golden Georgia sun dip slowly below the tree line, casting long, peaceful shadows across the vibrant green grass of my backyard. The insidious evil that had attempted to fracture my bloodline was completely eradicated. The balance of our world had been flawlessly and permanently restored. I stood in the quiet twilight surrounded by the joyful sounds of my unbroken family, finally enjoying the absolute unshakable peace of a silent adjustment perfectly executed. The greatest deception a person can fall for is believing that volume equates to strength and that currency equates to character. My journey through the darkest corners of high society taught me that the most dangerous predators do not lurk in back alleys. They wear tailored suits, hide behind generational wealth, and use their unearned privilege to crush anyone they deem entirely insignificant. The Whitcomb family fundamentally misunderstood the true anatomy of absolute power. They believed that by stripping my daughter of her financial assets and isolating her in a freezing city, they had entirely erased her existence. They mistook my faded canvas jacket and heavy work boots for an inherent lack of intelligence. They learned the devastating lesson that a quiet man who has built an empire from the concrete up carries a lethal resolve that money simply cannot ever buy. True wealth is never measured by the size of a sprawling estate or the balance of an offshore trust fund. It is measured by the unbreakable spine you forge when the world attempts to violently break you. I did not just recover my grandson and dismantle a corrupt real estate dynasty. I guided my daughter through the fiery crucible of hard labor and watched her emerge as an unstoppable corporate force. Alicia learned that dignity cannot be inherited or purchased with a platinum credit card. It must be earned on the loading docks of reality, completely devoid of any aristocratic safety nets. If there is one absolute truth to extract from this ordeal, it is that you must never allow the arrogant to dictate your inherent worth. When facing those who weaponize their status to inflict cruelty, you do not need to scream your defiance into the void. You must simply stand firm and silently destroy their empire. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let us meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks, so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There is so much more on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.